Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I never believed in monsters. 23 years as a park ranger, and I'd seen just about everything the wilderness could throw at a person, or so I thought. But that night in Shadow Pine National Forest changed everything. It was supposed to be a routine patrol. Instead, it became a nightmare that still haunts me to this day. The sun had just dipped below the jagged tree line as I climbed into my patrol truck. A warm breeze carried the scent of pine and wildflowers through my open window. It was the kind of perfect summer evening that reminded me why I'd chosen this life in the first place. Heading out, Jake, the junior ranger on duty, called from the station's porch. I nodded, cranking the engine to life. Just a quick loop through the backcountry campsites. Should be back before midnight. Jake grinned. Watch out for Bigfoot out there. I rolled my eyes, used to the good-natured ribbing about my skepticism towards the local cryptid legends. If I see him, I'll be sure to snap a selfie for you. As I pulled away from the ranger station, I had no idea those words would come back to haunt me. The gravel road wound deeper into the forest, golden sunlight fading to purple twilight. I flicked on my headlights, illuminating a tunnel through the dense pines. The radio crackled with routine chatter, a lost hiker reunited with their group, a reminder about the fire ban, nothing out of the ordinary. An hour into my patrol, full darkness had settled over the forest. My headlights caught the reflective eyes of deer and the occasional owl as I made my way from campsite to campsite. Most were empty this late in the season, just a few die-hard campers braving the cooling nights. I'd just finished checking in on a young couple at Moose Creek Campground when the first howl echoed through the trees. I froze, hand on the truck's door handle. In all my years out here, I'd never heard anything like it. It started low, almost subsonic, before climbing to a keening wail that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Probably just a coyote, I muttered, trying to convince myself. But deep down, I knew that sound came from something much, much bigger. I keyed my radio. "Base, this is Ranger Walsh. You copy?" Static answered me. I frowned, tapping the device. We sometimes lost signal in the deeper valleys, but I wasn't in one now. I tried again, but only got more crackling silence in response. Another howl split the night, closer this time. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. Whatever was making that sound, it was big and it was moving fast. I slid into the driver's seat, debating whether to continue my patrol or head back to the station. Pride warred with an instinct I couldn't quite name. In the end, duty won out. I had one more campsite to check, and I'd be damned if I let some oversized coyote scare me off. The road to Blackwater Campground was barely more than a trail, requiring all my focus to navigate in the dark. My headlights caught something at the edge of the tree line. Movement, just for a second. I slammed on the brakes, heart pounding. "Hello!" I called out the window, more out of habit than any real expectation of a response. "This is Park Ranger Walsh. Is anyone out there?" Silence answered me, broken only by the idle of my engine and the faint rustle of wind through the pines. I reached for my heavy-duty flashlight, flicking it on and sweeping the beam across the underbrush. Nothing. And then, eyes. A pair of eyes reflecting my light, set unnaturally high off the ground. They blinked once and disappeared. My mouth went dry. Those eyes had been at least 8 feet up, far too high for any animal native to these woods. I gunned the engine, tires spinning in the loose gravel as I sped towards Blackwater. Part of me wanted to turn around, to get the hell out of there. But I couldn't shake the nagging thought, what if someone was in trouble out here? The campground came into view, a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. My headlights swept across empty fire pits and picnic tables. No tents, no cars. I breathed a sigh of relief. At least I wouldn't have to evacuate any campers. I climbed out of the truck, flashlight in one hand and my other resting on the butt of my sidearm. The night had gone preternaturally still. No insects chirping, no owls hooting. It was as if the whole forest was holding its breath. Another howl shattered the silence, so close it felt like it was coming from inside my own head. I spun around, heart hammering against my ribs. My flashlight beam caught something massive moving through the trees at the edge of the clearing. It was huge, at least 9 feet tall, covered in dark fur. It moved with a fluid grace that belied its size, loping between the pines on all fours. As it passed through a shaft of moonlight, I caught a glimpse of its face. God help me, it was like nothing I'd ever seen before. A twisted mashup of wolf and man, with a long canine snout full of gleaming teeth and disturbingly human eyes. Those eyes locked onto mine for just a second, filled with an intelligence that sent ice water flooding through my veins. I stumbled backwards, fumbling for my radio with numb fingers. "Base, come in! This is an emergency!" Only static answered me. The creature, and there was no other word for it, had disappeared back into the shadows. But I could hear it moving, circling the clearing, hunting me. I sprinted for my truck, lungs burning as I sucked in the cool night air. Just as I reached for the door handle, something slammed into the side of the vehicle with bone-jarring force. The truck rocked on its suspension, tires lifting off the ground for a heart-stopping moment. A massive, clawed hand appeared on the roof, peeling back the metal like it was tinfoil. That horrible face lowered into view, lips pulled back in a snarl that was equal parts rage and hunger. I don't remember drawing my gun. 1 second it was in its holster. The next, I was emptying the magazine into the creature's chest. The reports were deafening in the confined space, muzzle flashes lighting up the interior like strobes. The thing roared, a sound of pain and fury that I felt in my bones. It reared back, freeing me to slam the key into the ignition. I threw the truck into reverse, tires spinning as I backed away from the howling monstrosity. My rear tires hit something solid. A tree. I was pinned. The creature recovered quickly, shaking off bullet wounds that should have dropped an elephant. It advanced on me with terrible purpose, saliva dripping from knife-like fangs. This was it. I was going to die out here, torn apart by something that shouldn't exist. I closed my eyes, sent up a silent prayer, and waited for the end. The crack of a high-powered rifle split the night. The creature's head snapped back, a spray of dark blood exploding from its skull. It stumbled, massive body swaying like a felled tree. Another shot rang out, and another. The thing collapsed, hitting the ground with an impact I felt through the truck. Silence fell once more, broken only by my ragged breathing and the ping of my overtaxed engine cooling down. "Ranger Walsh!" a voice called out. "Sarah, are you all right?" I looked up to see Jake jogging towards me, rifle held at the ready. I wanted to laugh. I wanted to cry. I settled for a shaky nod. "I'm okay," I managed to croak out. What the hell was that thing?" Jake's face was grim as he helped me out of the truck. "Something that shouldn't be here. We've had reports, but I never thought—" I turned to look at the fallen creature, determined to prove to myself that I hadn't hallucinated the whole thing. But where the massive body should have been, there was nothing. No blood, no fur, not even broken branches or disturbed earth. It was gone. Jake saw the confusion on my face. "They never leave evidence," he said softly. It's why no one believes." I sank to my knees, the adrenaline crash hitting me like a freight train. "I don't understand," I whispered. Jake knelt beside me, putting a comforting hand on my shoulder. "There's a lot you don't know about these woods, Sarah, a lot none of us fully understand. But after tonight, well, let's just say you've been initiated into a very exclusive club." I looked up at him, saw the weight of knowledge in his eyes, of secrets kept and horrors witnessed. In that moment, I knew my life would never be the same. As we drove back to the station in Jake's truck, the forest seemed alive in a way it never had before. Every shadow held the potential for terror, every rustle of leaves a lurking monster. I found myself wondering how many other things were out there, hiding just beyond the reach of our flashlights and rational minds. How many other rangers had experiences like mine, only to have the evidence vanish like mist in the morning sun? One thing was certain, I would never look at these woods the same way again. And as for monsters, well, let's just say I'm a believer now. Story 2. The old-timers warned me about the things that lurk in these woods. I laughed it off, chalking it up to superstition and too much whiskey. But as I sit here, 50 feet above the ground in this creaking fire tower, with something massive circling below, I'm not laughing anymore. I'm praying that the sun will rise before whatever's down there finds a way up. It all started 3 days ago. I just finished my training as a fire lookout volunteer, eager to spend a summer alone in the wilderness. The job was simple: man the tower, scan the horizon for smoke, and radio in if I spotted anything. A perfect gig for a wannabe writer looking for solitude and inspiration. The drive up to Broken Fang Lookout was an adventure in itself. My old Jeep groaned as it crawled up the winding dirt road, branches scraping against the sides like bony fingers. As the trees thinned out, I caught my first glimpse of the tower, a stark silhouette against the fading daylight, perched on a rocky outcropping like something out of a Hitchcock film. Bob, the grizzled ranger who'd driven up to meet me, helped unload my gear. As we hauled the last of my supplies up the dizzying stairs, he paused, his weathered face unusually serious. "Listen, kid," he said, eyes darting to the deepening shadows in the valley below. "But there's things out here, things you can't explain. If you hear anything strange at night, anything at all, you stay put. Don't go investigating. Don't even look out the windows. You hear me?" I nodded, hiding a smirk. "Great. Another superstitious local." "Sure thing, Bob. I'll keep an eye out for Bigfoot." He didn't laugh. "I'm serious, son. These woods, they've got secrets. Dark ones. You take care now." With that cryptic warning, he was gone, leaving me alone with the whispering wind and the creaking of the old tower. The first 2 nights passed uneventfully. I settled into a routine, scanning the horizon with high-powered binoculars, logging my observations, and working on my novel. The solitude was exactly what I'd hoped for, the vast wilderness stretching out below me like an endless green sea. It was on the 3rd night that everything changed. I'd just finished my evening radio check-in and was heating up a can of soup when I heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I froze, spoon halfway to my mouth, straining my ears. There it was again, louder this time. It wasn't a bear or a mountain lion. Hell, it wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard. It sounded wrong, unnatural. I set my soup down with shaking hands and moved to the window. The full moon bathed the clearing around the tower in silvery light, but the surrounding forest was a wall of impenetrable darkness. Movement caught my eye. Something massive shifted in the tree line, just beyond the reach of the moonlight. I blinked, sure I was seeing things. But no, there it was again. A dark shape, easily 8 or 9 feet tall, moving with a fluidity that belied its size. My breath caught in my throat as it stepped into the clearing. Oh God, oh Jesus. It was vaguely humanoid, but wrong in every way that mattered, covered in thick, matted fur. Arms too long, ending in hands tipped with wicked claws. And its face, a nightmarish blend of wolf and man, with eyes that glowed an unholy yellow in the moonlight. I stumbled back from the window, my heart pounding so hard I was sure the thing could hear it. This couldn't be real. I was dreaming. I had to be. A splintering crack shattered the night. I spun to see massive claw marks appear in the wooden door, as if carved by an invisible hand. The whole tower shook as something slammed against the base. This was no dream. I lunged for the radio, my fingers fumbling with the dials. "Mayday! Mayday! This is Broken Fang Lookout. I'm under attack by... What the hell could I even say? There's something out here. I need help." Only static answered me. I swore, checking the connections. Everything seemed fine. But no matter how I yelled into the mic, no one responded. Another impact rocked the tower. I heard wood splintering, metal groaning. How long before the whole structure came down? I scrambled to the emergency kit, praying there was anything I could use as a weapon. A flare gun, not much, but better than nothing. I loaded it with trembling hands, the sound of rending wood and inhuman snarls filling the air. For hours, the assault continued. I huddled in the center of the room, flare gun clutched to my chest as the thing circled below. Sometimes it would go quiet, and I'd dare to hope it had given up. Then another earth-shaking blow would come, and I'd bite back a scream. Sometime in those long, terrifying hours, my mind began to wander. I thought about Bob's warning, about all the stories I dismissed as mere folk tales. How many other poor bastards had found themselves in this situation, alone in the dark, with something that shouldn't exist? A particularly vicious attack snapped me back to reality. The whole tower swayed, and for a heart-stopping moment I was sure it would topple, but the old structure held, groaning in protest. As silence fell once more, I crept to the window. The thing was at the base of the tower now, pacing in tight circles. Even from this height, I could see the intelligence burning in those sulphurous eyes. It wasn't just trying to get in. It was looking for weaknesses, probing for a way up. My gaze fell on the ladder leading up to the tower. So far, the creature's massive size had worked in my favor, keeping it from climbing. But as I watched, it reared up on its hind legs, massive paws wrapping around the lowest rung. Metal screamed as it began to pull. "No, no, no," I muttered, raising the flare gun with shaking hands. I had one shot, one chance to drive this thing away before it brought the whole tower down. The creature's head snapped up, those terrible eyes locking onto mine. Its muzzle pulled back in a snarl, revealing rows of dagger-like teeth. This was it. Do or die time. I pulled the trigger. The flare erupted from the barrel with a whoosh, trailing sparks as it arced through the night. For a moment, the world was bathed in crimson light. I caught a full glimpse of the monster, all rippling muscle and matted fur, a walking nightmare straight out of humanity's darkest primordial memories. The flare struck it square in the chest. The thing's roar of pain and fury shook the windows. It reared back, clawing at the burning phosphorus embedded in its hide. In its frenzy, it stumbled away from the tower, back towards the tree line. I allowed myself a moment of hope. Maybe that was enough. Maybe it would retreat to lick its wounds. But as the flare sputtered out, plunging the world back into darkness, I heard it again, that bone-chilling growl, now edged with rage. It wasn't leaving. If anything, I'd only made it angrier. The attacks resumed with renewed vigor. Each impact threatened to shake the tower apart. I braced myself against the wall, feeling every blow reverberate through the metal struts. How much longer could this place hold out? How much longer could I? As if in answer to my unspoken question, I heard a sound that turned my blood to ice. The groan of metal giving way. The lowest section of ladder, weakened by the creature's earlier assault, finally surrendered to gravity. It crashed to the ground with a cacophony of clangs. Silence fell. I held my breath, ears straining. Nothing. Then a new sound. The scrape of claws on metal. Oh God, it was climbing. I scrambled to the window, desperation overriding fear. There it was, hauling its massive bulk up the tower's framework with terrifying speed. Those yellow eyes gleamed with triumph. It knew it had won. Panic overwhelmed me. I grabbed anything I could find, books, tools, my camping gear, and hurled them at the advancing monstrosity. Most bounced harmlessly off its bulk. A heavy wrench connected with its skull, drawing a snarl of pain, but it barely slowed. 10 feet, 5 feet. I could smell its fetid breath now, see the saliva dripping from its jaws. This was it. I closed my eyes, waiting for the end. A sound cut through my terror, a sound so beautiful, so welcome, I could have wept. Helicopter blades. My eyes snapped open. There, just cresting the eastern ridge, a search and rescue chopper, its spotlight sweeping the ground. The creature froze, mere inches from the platform. For a long moment, we stared at each other. I saw the fury in its eyes, the hunger, but I also saw something else. Fear. It knew its time was up. With a final, ear-splitting roar that was equal parts rage and frustration, it released its grip on the tower. I watched, stunned, as it plummeted to the ground. It landed with an impact that shook the earth, then loped off into the forest with impossible speed. By the time the chopper reached me, it was long gone. The official report would later chalk my experience up to hallucinations brought on by isolation and altitude sickness. The damage to the tower. Vandals, probably. But I know the truth. I know what's out there, hiding in the dark spaces of the world, and I know that I'll never look at the wilderness the same way again. As for fire lookout duty, well, let's just say I've developed a newfound appreciation for city life. Story 3. They say long-haul trucking is a lonely job, but I never minded the solitude. That is, until the night I saw something on that mountain highway that shattered my understanding of reality. Now the darkness beyond my headlights holds terrors I can't even begin to comprehend. My name's Mike, and I've been driving big rigs for the better part of 2 decades. I've seen my fair share of weird stuff out on the road, ghost lights, unexplained shadows, even a UFO or two if you catch me after a few beers. But nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered on Route 491 through the Rockies. It was a run like any other. Denver to Seattle, hauling a load of electronics. I'd done this route 100 times before, could probably drive it blindfolded if you'd let me. The night was clear, a full moon hanging low over the jagged peaks. Perfect driving conditions. I'd just passed the Colorado-Utah border, the cab of my Peterbilt filled with the twangy sounds of some late-night country station. The road ahead was empty, nothing but miles of blacktop stretching into the darkness, just how I liked it. The first sign that something was off came around 1 a.m. My radio, which had been crystal clear moments before, suddenly erupted in a burst of static. I fiddled with the dial, trying to get the station back, but there was nothing but white noise across all bands. "Damn mountains," I muttered, giving up and switching it off. The silence that filled the cab was oppressive, broken only by the steady rumble of my engine. That's when I saw it, just for a second, illuminated in my high beams. Movement on the shoulder of the road. Something big. My foot instinctively eased off the gas, years of experience kicking in. Probably a deer or an elk, I thought. Wouldn't be the first time I'd had a close call with wildlife out here. But as I drew closer, I realized this was no deer, no elk, no animal I'd ever seen before. It was standing in the middle of the road now, and I felt my blood run cold. The thing was massive, at least 8 feet tall, covered in thick, matted fur. But it wasn't the size that sent a spike of primal terror through my gut. It was the way it stood, upright on 2 legs, like a man that was more beast than human. My headlights caught its face, and I felt my heart stop. Dear God, it was like something out of a nightmare, a muzzle filled with gleaming fangs, ears pointed and alert, but the eyes were the worst part, yellow and glowing, filled with an intelligence that had no place in an animal. Time seemed to slow down. I was doing 70, bearing down on this thing at a speed that should have sent any sane creature bolting for the trees, but it just stood there, staring at me with those hellish eyes. I had a split second to make a decision. Swerve and risk jackknifing my trailer, or plow straight through and pray my truck could take the impact. My hands moved of their own accord, yanking the wheel hard to the left. Tires screamed on asphalt as 40 tons of steel and cargo fought against momentum. I felt the trailer start to slide, threatening to overtake the cab in a deadly push. The world spun around me. I caught flashes of guardrail, of steep drops into inky blackness. The creature disappeared from view as my truck pirouetted across the highway like some grotesque ballet. Then, with a bone-jarring impact, it was over. My truck slammed to a halt, tilted at a sickening angle. Steam hissed from somewhere under the crumpled hood. The silence that followed was deafening. I hung there, suspended by my seatbelt, struggling to catch my breath. Every inch of me ached, but a quick mental inventory told me nothing was broken. I was alive, somehow, That's when I heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Ice water flooded my veins. It was still out there. With trembling hands, I unclipped my seatbelt, nearly falling onto the passenger door as I freed myself. My flashlight. Where was my damn flashlight? I fumbled in the glove box, acutely aware of how exposed I was. The windshield had spiderwebbed on impact, obscuring my view of the road. My fingers closed around the heavy maglite. Not much of a weapon, but better than nothing. I pushed myself up, peering out through the cracked glass. The moon had disappeared behind a bank of clouds, plunging the world into near total darkness. My headlights, miraculously still functioning, cut twin swaths through the gloom. There, movement at the edge of the light. Something massive shifted in the shadows. I swallowed hard, my mouth bone dry, scraping sounds from the passenger side, claws on metal. Oh, Jesus! It was coming around the truck. I had to move, had to get out, but terror had turned my limbs to lead. I could only watch, paralyzed, as a huge, fur-covered arm came into view. Muscles rippled beneath the matted hair as it gripped the doorframe. The metal groaned, buckled. With a shriek of tearing steel, the entire door was ripped away. I found my voice then, a scream tearing from my throat as I scrambled across the cab. My fingers scrabbled at the handle of the driver's side door. Locked. Of course it was fucking locked. Hot, fetid breath washed over me. I turned slowly to face my doom. It filled the entire passenger side of the cab, yellow eyes gleaming in the darkness. This close, I could see the details I'd missed before, the way its fur was patchy in places, revealing leathery skin beneath, the way its hands were almost human, save for the wicked claws tipping each finger. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. I waited for it to lunge, to tear me apart with those massive jaws, but it just watched. Studied me, like it was trying to figure out what I was. And then, to my utter disbelief, it spoke. "Why, here!" The voice was guttural, more growl than speech, but there was no mistaking the words. My mind reeled. This couldn't be happening. I had to be dreaming, or dead. Maybe I'd died in the crash and this was some sort of fucked up purgatory. What? I managed to croak out, its muzzle pulled back in what might have been a grimace or a smile. "No! Belong! Go!" Before I could even begin to process what was happening, it was gone. Just like that. One moment filling my cab with its massive presence, the next vanishing into the night like smoke. I sat there shaking for I don't know how long. The sound of approaching sirens finally snapped me out of my daze. Someone must have seen the wreck, called it in. By the time the state troopers arrived, I'd managed to pull myself together enough to climb out of the cab. They found me sitting on the guardrail, staring out into the darkness. I told them about losing control on the wet road, about swerving to avoid a deer. They bought it. Why wouldn't they? It was a hell of a lot more believable than the truth. As they loaded me into an ambulance for a trip to the nearest hospital, I caught a glimpse of something on the cliff face across the highway. Just for a second, illuminated by flashing red and blue lights, a massive, fur-covered figure. It raised a hand, almost like a wave, before melting back into the shadows. I blinked, and it was gone. The official accident report blamed a blown tire and driver fatigue. My company was understanding, gave me some time off to recover. But how do you recover from something like that? How do you go back to a normal life when you've seen behind the curtain, caught a glimpse of the impossible? I tried to forget, tried to convince myself it was all some kind of hallucination brought on by the crash. But deep down, I knew that there were things out there in the dark, things that defied explanation. I'm back on the road now. Had to be. Driving's all I know, but things are different. I don't do night runs anymore if I can help it, and I avoid that stretch of Route 491 like the plague. Sometimes, on long hauls through lonely country, I'll catch a glimpse of something moving just beyond my headlights, a flash of yellow eyes in my rearview mirror, and I'll remember that night, remember the creature's words, "No belong, go." Maybe it was a warning, maybe a threat, but one thing's for sure, I'll never look at the darkness beyond the asphalt the same way again, because now I know what's out there, hiding just out of sight, waiting. Story 4. I've always been a woman of science, relying on hard facts and empirical evidence. But when I saw that footage, everything I thought I knew about the natural world crumbled. Now, I'm left questioning not just my career, but the very fabric of reality itself. My name is Dr. Elena Reeves, and until 3 days ago, I was a respected wildlife biologist specializing in large predator behavior. I've spent countless hours in the field, tracking everything from grizzlies in Alaska to jaguars in the Amazon. I thought I'd seen it all. I was wrong, so very wrong. It started as a routine project. The National Park Service had contracted our team to conduct a population survey of black bears in Glacier National Park. Standard stuff. Set up trail cameras, collect data, analyze movement patterns. I'd done it a dozen times before. We'd been in the field for about a week, my research assistant Jake and I, when we decided to check the memory cards on our first batch of cameras. It was a crisp autumn morning, the kind that makes you glad to be alive and out in nature. The leaves were just starting to turn, painting the mountainsides in vibrant reds and golds. And $10 says we caught old Scarface on camera. 3, Jake said as we hiked up to our first checkpoint. Old Scarface was a notorious male black bear, known for his distinctive facial markings and penchant for raiding campsites. I grinned, accepting the bet. "You're on. My money's on that young female we spotted near Avalanche Creek." We reached the tree where we'd mounted the camera, and I felt a twinge of unease. The bark around the mounting bracket was scored with deep claw marks, far larger than anything a black bear should have been able to make. "Huh," Jake said, running his fingers over the gouges. "Grizzly, you think?" I frowned. "Maybe, but we're pretty far out of their usual range here." We pulled the memory card and moved on to the next camera, and the next. Each one showed similar signs of disturbance, claw marks, broken branches, even one camera that had been completely ripped from its mount and tossed several yards away. By the time we got back to our base camp, my unease had blossomed into full-blown concern. This wasn't normal bear behavior, not by a long shot. We fired up the laptop and started reviewing the footage. The first few cameras showed what we expected: deer, elk, the occasional black bear ambling through the frame. Nothing out of the ordinary. Then we got to camera 7. The timestamp showed 2:14 a.m. 3 nights ago. The infrared sensor had been triggered by movement, switching the camera to night vision mode. For several seconds, the frame was empty, save for gently swaying branches. Then it appeared. My breath caught in my throat. Beside me, I heard Jake mutter a string of expletives. Into the frame stalked something. It was vaguely humanoid, but wrong in every way that mattered. Easily 8 feet tall, maybe more, covered in thick, matted fur. Its arms were too long, hanging almost to the ground, ending in hands tipped with wicked claws. But it was the face that sent ice water flooding through my veins. A nightmarish blend of human and animal features, with a protruding snout filled with gleaming fangs. And the eyes. Dear God, the eyes. They glowed an unnatural, pale green in the camera's infrared light, filled with an intelligence that had no place in a wild animal. The creature moved with an unsettling grace, its massive bulk navigating the underbrush with ease. It paused directly in front of the camera, nose twitching as if scenting the air. Then, with horrifying deliberation, it turned to face the lens. For a moment, it simply stared, those eerie eyes seeming to look right through the camera, right at us. Then its muzzle pulled back in what could only be described as a grin, revealing row upon row of dagger-like teeth. A clawed hand reached out towards the camera. The last frame showed massive fingers filling the lens before the video cut to static. Silence fell over our camp. I realized I'd been holding my breath and let it out in a shaky exhale. What the hell was that? Jake's voice was barely above a whisper. I shook my head, unable to form words. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what we'd just seen. Some kind of undiscovered primate, a bear with a genetic mutation. But deep down, I knew this was something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist. "Play it again," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. We watched it 3 more times, scrutinizing every detail. Each viewing only confirmed the impossible. This was no known animal, not even close. "We need to report this," Jake said, already reaching for our satellite phone. I caught his wrist. Just wait a second. We need to think this through." He stared at me, incredulous. "Think what through?" "Elena, we just recorded fucking Bigfoot. This is huge." "Exactly," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "It's huge. World-changing. We need to be absolutely sure before we go public with this." Jake ran a hand through his hair, visibly agitated. "So what, we just sit on this? Pretend we didn't see anything?" I shook my head. "No, we gather more evidence, set up more cameras. Maybe try to get a DNA sample if we can find any hair or scat." "You want to go looking for that thing?" Jake's voice cracked on the last word. I understood his fear. Hell, every instinct I had was screaming at me to pack up and get as far away from these woods as possible. But the scientist in me, the part that had dedicated my life to understanding the natural world, couldn't let this go. "We don't have to decide right now," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Let's review the rest of the footage, see if we caught anything else. Then we can make a plan." Jake nodded, reluctantly. We spent the next several hours going through every second of video from our cameras. Most showed nothing out of the ordinary, but 2 more had captured glimpses of our mystery creature. Brief flashes of movement, a pair of glowing eyes in the distance. Nothing as clear as that first sighting, but enough to confirm it wasn't a one-off glitch or hallucination. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across our camp, we finally took a break. Jake busied himself making dinner while I sat staring at the laptop screen, that impossible image frozen in high definition. "You know we're not equipped to handle this," Jake said, as he handed me a bowl of reheated chili. "Whatever that thing is, it's way out of our league." I nodded, absently stirring my food. "I know, but think about it, Jake. If this is real, and I know how crazy this sounds, but if it's real, it could rewrite everything we know about evolution, about the natural world. We can't just walk away from that." Jake was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was soft. "What if it doesn't want to be discovered?" A chill ran down my spine as I remembered those intelligent eyes, that deliberate grin. He had a point. Whatever this creature was, it had managed to stay hidden from science for God knows how long. What if it was actively avoiding detection, as if in answer to our unspoken fears? A howl split the night. It started low, almost subsonic, before rising to a keening wail that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before. Not wolf, not coyote, not any known animal. Jake and I locked eyes, a moment of shared terror passing between us. We both knew, without a doubt, that the sound had come from our mystery creature, and it was close, very close. "Pack up," I said, already shoving equipment into my backpack. "We're getting out of here. Now." We broke camp in record time, not even bothering to properly stow our gear. As we stumbled down the trail by headlamp light, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sent my heart racing. We made it back to our truck, just as false dawn was beginning to lighten the eastern sky. As Jake gunned the engine, I looked back at the wall of trees we'd just emerged from. For just a second, I could have sworn I saw a pair of pale green eyes watching us from the underbrush. Then we rounded a bend, and the forest was lost from view. We drove in silence for a long time, each lost in our own thoughts. Finally, as we neared the park boundary, Jake spoke up. "What do we do now?" I sighed, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders. "I don't know. Part of me wants to burn that footage and pretend this never happened. But we're scientists, Jake finished for me. And this could be the discovery of the century. I nodded. We need to be smart about this. Gather more evidence. Build an ironclad case before we go public. Otherwise, we'll be laughed out of academia. As we drove back towards civilization, I couldn't shake the memory of those eyes, the intelligence behind them, the sense that perhaps we weren't the ones making a discovery. Maybe, just maybe, we were the ones being discovered. One thing was certain. My world had changed forever, and I had a feeling this was only the beginning of a much larger, much stranger journey. Story 5. I've always loved the wilderness, but after what happened in those God-forsaken mountains, I don't think I'll ever step foot in the backcountry again. They say hunger can drive a person mad, but what we experienced out there, it was something else entirely. Something ancient, something evil. My name's Alex, and up until 2 weeks ago, I was just your average outdoor enthusiast with a desk job and a yearning for adventure. My best friend, Mika, and I had been planning this backcountry trip through the Rockies for months. 10 days of pure wilderness, pushing our limits and escaping the grind of city life. We thought we were prepared for anything the mountains could throw at us. We were wrong. The first 3 days were everything we'd hoped for. Challenging hikes, breathtaking vistas, and that indescribable sense of freedom that comes from being miles from civilization. We'd plotted our route carefully, aiming to cover about 10 miles a day through some of the most remote terrain in Colorado. It was on the 4th day that things started to go sideways. We woke to grey skies and a biting wind that cut through our layers like they were tissue paper. As we broke camp, I noticed Mika frowning at her GPS. "That's weird," she muttered, tapping the screen. "What's up?" She showed me the device. According to the map, we were a good 5 miles east of where we should have been. "Must be a glitch," I said, pulling out our backup paper map. "We'll navigate the old-fashioned way today." But as the hours wore on and landmarks failed to materialize where they should have been, a knot of unease began to form in my stomach. The terrain didn't match our map at all. Ridgelines zigged where they should have zagged. Valleys appeared where there should have been peaks. "Alex," Mika said as we paused for a water break, her voice tight with worry, "I think we're lost." I wanted to reassure her, to say she was wrong. But looking at the unfamiliar landscape around us, I knew she was right. Somehow, we'd wandered far off our planned route. "Okay," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "We've got enough food for another week. We'll backtrack. Try to find a landmark we recognize." Mika nodded, but I could see the fear in her eyes. We both knew the statistics. Even experienced hikers could die out here if they weren't found quickly. We picked a direction and started walking, hoping to hit a trail or a recognizable feature. But as the day wore on and the weather worsened, that hope began to fade. The temperature dropped rapidly, and soon fat, wet snowflakes were falling from the leaden sky. "We need to make camp!" I shouted over the rising wind, "before this turns into a full-on storm." We found a small copse of trees that offered some shelter and hurriedly set up our tent. As we huddled inside, the wind howling around us, I tried to push down the panic clawing at my throat. We were in trouble, serious trouble. That was the first night we heard the screams. They started just after midnight, jolting both of us from an uneasy sleep. At first, I thought it was the wind, but wind doesn't sound like a person being tortured. Wind doesn't make sounds that are almost words, almost human, but twisted into something wrong. "What the hell is that?" Mika whispered, her face pale in the dim light of our lantern. I shook my head, unable to speak. Every instinct I had was screaming danger. We listened, frozen, as the sounds moved around our campsite, sometimes closer, sometimes further away, but always circling, always watching. Neither of us slept that night. Dawn brought no relief. The storm had passed, but we woke to find bizarre scratch marks on the trees surrounding our camp. Deep gouges in the bark, far too high to have been made by any normal animal. "Do we need to get out of here?" Mika said, her voice shaking. "Now!" I couldn't have agreed more. We broke camp in record time and started moving, picking a direction at random. Anything to get away from whatever had been out there last night. But as the day wore on, it became clear we were only getting more lost. The landscape seemed to shift around us, landmarks disappearing or changing as soon as we looked away. And all the while, that feeling of being watched grew stronger. It was late afternoon when we heard the screams again. Closer this time, much closer. "Run!" I yelled, grabbing Mika's hand. We crashed through the underbrush, blind panic driving us forward. Branches whipped at our faces, roots seemed to reach up to trip us. And always, those terrible screams pursued us, getting closer with each passing second. I don't know how long we ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that mad flight, but eventually we burst out of the trees into a small clearing and skidded to a halt. There, in the center of the clearing, stood a crude structure. At first I thought it was some kind of old trapper's cabin, but as my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I realized with dawning horror what I was actually seeing. It was a shrine. Bones, animal and disturbingly human-looking, lashed together with sinew to form a grotesque altar. Strange symbols carved into the skulls, and everywhere that sickly sweet smell of rotting meat. "Oh God!" Mika choked out. "Alex, what is this place?" Before I could answer, movement caught my eye. Something was emerging from the trees on the far side of the clearing. Something tall, impossibly thin, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. I blinked, and suddenly it was halfway across the clearing. I hadn't even seen it move. It was only about 20 feet away now, and I could make out details I immediately wished I hadn't. Its skin was a sickly greyish white, stretched taut over a skeletal frame. But it was the face that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. A mouth far too wide, filled with needle-sharp teeth, and the eyes, dear God, the eyes. Black as pitch, but with a horrible intelligence burning in their depths. It opened its mouth, and that terrible scream poured out, but this close, I could make out words hidden in the sound. "Hungry," it seemed to say. "So hungry." "Wendigo," Mika whispered beside me. "It's a Wendigo." I'd heard the legends, of course. Every hiker in these parts knew the stories of the cannibalistic spirit that possessed humans, cursing them with an insatiable hunger. But those were just campfire tales. They couldn't be real. Except here we were, face to face with the impossible. The thing, the Wendigo, took another step towards us. I could feel its hunger like a physical force, an unnatural craving that threatened to draw us in. "We have to go," I managed to croak out. Now!" We turned to run, but the Wendigo was suddenly there, blocking our path. It moved with a speed that defied physics, flickering from place to place like a glitch in reality. "No escape," it hissed, its voice like dead leaves scraping over bone. "You are ours now," Mika screamed. The sound seemed to energize the Wendigo, its emaciated body trembling with excitement. It reached for us with grotesquely long fingers, tipped with yellowed claws. In that moment, some primitive part of my brain took over. I grabbed a branch from the ground and swung it with all my might at the Wendigo's head. To my shock, it connected. The creature stumbled back, more surprised than hurt. "The shrine!" Mika yelled. "Destroy the shrine!" It was crazy, but we had no other options. We charged towards the bone altar, the Wendigo's shrieks of rage following us. I swung my makeshift club at the structure, feeling bones snap under the impact. Mika kicked at the base, sending skulls and femurs scattering. The Wendigo howled, a sound of fury and pain. The air around us seemed to ripple, reality bending in ways that made my eyes water. And then, with a sound like a thunderclap, everything went white. I came to with the taste of blood in my mouth, and Mika shaking my shoulder. We were lying at the base of a cliff, our packs scattered around us. Of the clearing, the shrine, and the Wendigo, there was no sign. "Alex," Mika said, her voice hoarse. "Look." She pointed up the cliff face. There, barely visible against the grey stone, was a trail marker. Our trail marker. Somehow, we were back on our original route. We never did figure out what exactly happened up there. Search and rescue found us 2 days later, half-starved and babbling about monsters in the woods. They chalked it up to hallucinations from exposure and dehydration. But Micah and I know the truth. We know what's really out there, hiding in the dark spaces of the world, waiting hungry. These days, I stick to well-traveled trails and sunny picnic spots, and if I hear anything that sounds even remotely like a scream while I'm in the woods, well, let's just say I'm not ashamed to admit I run the other way, because now I know the truth of those old legends. And I know that sometimes, just sometimes, hunger can create monsters that are all too real. Story 6. I used to think the worst thing that could happen on a family road trip was running out of snacks or getting stuck in traffic. Now I know better. Now I know that there are things out there in the dark, things that shouldn't exist, things that hunger for more than just beef jerky and trail mix. My name's Lisa, and this is the story of how a broken-down minivan turned into a nightmare that nearly cost me everything. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. Me, my husband Tom, and our 2 kids, Zach and Emma, heading up to my sister's cabin in the Cascades. We'd made the drive a dozen times before, knew every twist and turn of the winding mountain roads, but we'd never made the trip this late in the year. Never seen how quickly those picturesque forests could turn menacing once the sun went down. We were about 2 hours from the cabin when it happened. 1 minute we were cruising along, the kids bickering in the back seat over whose turn it was on the iPad. The next, our minivan was shuddering like it had hit an earthquake, the engine making a sound no engine should ever make. Tom managed to pull over onto a narrow shoulder just as the van gave up the ghost entirely. The sudden silence was deafening. "Everyone okay?" Tom asked, twisting in his seat to check on the kids. Zach, 12 going on 30, rolled his eyes. "We're fine, Dad. What's wrong with the car?" I was already pulling out my phone, ready to call for a tow, but as the screen lit up, my heart sank. No signal. "Try your phone," I said to Tom, trying to keep the worry out of my voice. He did, with the same result. We were well and truly off the grid. Tom popped the hood and spent a few minutes peering at the engine, but I could tell from his face it was a lost cause. Whatever had gone wrong was beyond his change the oil and rotate the tires level of car knowledge. "Okay," he said, closing the hood. "We're about 10 miles from Miller's Creek. I'll hike there and see if I can find help. You guys stay with the car." I didn't like it, but it made sense. 10 miles in the dark was no trip for the kids, and someone needed to stay with the van in case help came by. "Be careful," I said, pulling him close. "Dan, take this." I handed him our biggest flashlight and the emergency whistle from our glove compartment. He gave me a quick kiss. "I'll be back before you know it. Keep the doors locked." I watched him disappear into the darkness, the beam of his flashlight swallowed up by the towering pines. Then I turned back to the kids, plastering on my best "everything's fine" smile. "All right, crew. Looks like we're having a car camp out tonight. Who wants to break into the emergency snacks?" That kept them occupied for a while. We played I Spy and told stories, trying to ignore the deepening chill and the strange noises echoing from the surrounding forest. It was around midnight when Emma, my 8-year-old, tugged on my sleeve. "Mommy," she whispered, eyes wide. "I heard something." I was about to reassure her it was just the wind when I heard it too. A sound like wood knocking against wood, coming from the trees on the other side of the road. Knock, knock, knock. 3 distinct impacts, too regular to be random. "It's probably just a woodpecker," I said, not believing it for a second. Since when did woodpeckers work the night shift? The knocking came again, closer this time, followed by something else, a low, rumbling sound that might have been a growl, if growls could be as big as thunder. Zach sat up straight, all traces of preteen nonchalance gone. "Mom, what was that?" "I'm sure it's nothing," I said, reaching for the keys. I suddenly wanted to make very sure the doors were locked. "Why don't we try to get some sleep?" But sleep was the last thing on anyone's mind. We huddled together in the back seat, listening as the knocking and those skin-crawling growls moved around our van. Sometimes they seemed to fade into the distance, only to come roaring back twice as close. I found myself thinking of all the stories I'd heard about these mountains, tales of hikers gone missing, of strange footprints found in the snow, and other stories, older ones whispered by the local tribes, stories of a creature that walked like a man but was decidedly not human. I'd always laughed those stories off. I wasn't laughing now. A sharp crack split the night, so loud it made us all jump. It had come from right behind the van. Slowly, hesitantly, I turned to look out the rear window. There, illuminated in the pale moonlight, was a pine tree at the edge of the road. A pine tree with a trunk as thick as a telephone pole. A pine tree that was now bent at a 45-degree angle, as if something incredibly strong had simply pushed it aside. "Ooh, Mom." Emma's voice was barely a whisper. "What did that?" Before I could answer, before I could even process what I was seeing, a massive shape stepped out from behind the broken tree. My breath caught in my throat, every muscle in my body tensed. Flight or fight responses screaming at me to move, to run, to do something. But I was frozen, eyes locked on the impossible figure now standing mere yards from our van. It was huge. 8, maybe 9 feet tall, with a bulk that made it look like a bear that had decided to stand up and take a stroll. But this was no bear. Despite the thick fur covering its body, its shape was undeniably humanoid. Massive arms hung at its sides, ending in hands tipped with claws that looked like they could tear through sheet metal like tissue paper. Its legs were thick as tree trunks, bent slightly as if always ready to pounce. But it was the face that truly chilled my blood. A sloping forehead, a heavy brow ridge, and eyes that glinted with an intelligence that had no place in an animal. A very human-like nose sat above a mouth that was currently parted in a snarl, revealing teeth better suited to a saber-toothed tiger than any modern creature. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, the old legends made flesh. It took a step towards us, covering more ground with that single stride than a man could with 3. The van rocked as it placed a massive hand on the hood, peering in at us with eyes that reflected the moonlight like a cat's. Emma whimpered, burying her face in my side. Zach, my brave boy, moved to put himself between his sister and the window, though I could feel him trembling. The creature cocked its head, almost curiously. Then it leaned in closer, its breath fogging the glass. This close, I could see every detail of its face. The wispy fur, the weathered skin, the all-too-human emotion playing across its features, was that confusion in its eyes. It lifted its other hand, and for one heart-stopping moment, I thought it was going to smash through the window. Instead, it gently tapped the glass with one clawed finger. The sound was almost delicate, at odds with the raw power evident in every line of the creature's body. Tap, 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 3 distinct impacts, just like the knocking we'd heard earlier. And then, to my utter disbelief, it spoke. The sound was like gravel in a blender, more growl than speech, but there was a pattern to it, a rhythm that tickled at the edge of comprehension. It said something. 3 guttural syllables that vibrated through the van. Then it waited, looking at us expectantly. "Mom," Zach's voice cracked. I think it's trying to talk to us." He was right, I realized. This wasn't an attack. It was an attempt at communication. Slowly, hardly daring to breathe, I rolled down my window a crack. We don't understand," I said, my voice barely a whisper. The creature's eyes widened. It leaned in closer, nostrils flaring as it scented the air. Then it rumbled out those same 3 syllables again, slower this time. "Hoop man, here, human here." A chill ran down my spine. It was asking what we were doing in its territory. "Lost," I managed to say. "Our car broke. Help coming." The creature considered this for a long moment. Then, to my amazement, it nodded. Actually nodded. Like it understood, it straightened up, rising to its full, terrifying height. For a second, I thought it was going to leave. Instead, it turned and let out a long, ululating howl that seemed to shake the very air. An answering call echoed from the forest, then another, and another. Oh, God, there were more of them. But instead of attacking, the creature simply folded itself down into a sitting position next to our van. It turned those intelligent eyes on me once more and grunted out a single word, "Wait." And so we waited. The creature kept watch through the long, cold night, its massive form an oddly comforting presence in the darkness. Twice more it called out, and twice more those answering howls came. As the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, I heard a sound that made my heart leap, a car engine. Headlights appeared around the bend, and I recognized my husband's voice calling out. I turned to thank our strange guardian, but it was already gone, vanishing into the forest as silently as it had appeared. The official report blamed our hallucinations on carbon monoxide leaking into the cabin. A faulty exhaust pipe, they said. The bent tree must have been damaged in a recent storm, but my family and I know the truth. We know what's really out there in the wilderness. And we know that sometimes, just sometimes, the monsters aren't nearly as monstrous as we've been led to believe. Story 7. I've seen a lot in my 15 years as a park ranger, but nothing could have prepared me for that night. When you're surrounded by wilderness, you expect to deal with bears, mountain lions, maybe the occasional lost hiker. You don't expect to find yourself trapped in a life-or-death struggle with something that shouldn't exist, something that hungers for more than just food. My name's Jack, and this is the story of how I survived the longest night of my life. It started like any other shift at Shadow Pine National Forest. I'd just finished my afternoon patrol and was settling in for a quiet evening at the ranger station with my partner, Sarah. Outside, a late autumn storm was rolling in, the wind howling through the pines like a wounded animal. It looks like we're in for a rough night, Sarah said, peering out the window at the darkening sky. Glad we're not out there. I nodded, pouring myself a cup of coffee. Should be quiet at least. No sane hiker would be out in this weather. As if on cue, our radio crackled to life. The voice on the other end was panicked, barely audible over the static and howling wind. Attack. Not human. Oh God, it's coming back. Sarah and I exchanged glances. This is Ranger Station 17, I said into the mic. Please repeat your last transmission. Over. More static. Then, massive, like a wolf, but walking on 2 legs. It took Jim. Please, you have to... The transmission cut off abruptly. Did he say a wolf on 2 legs? Sarah asked, her face pale. I shook my head, trying to make sense of what we'd just heard. I must have garbled the transmission, probably a bear attack. But even as I said it, I knew that wasn't right. Bears don't walk on 2 legs, and they certainly don't single out one person to a take. I keyed the mic again. This is Ranger Station 17. We've received your distress call. Can you provide your location? Over. Nothing but static, answered me. Sarah was already pulling on her jacket. We have to go look for them. I hesitated. Protocol said we should wait for backup in situations like this. But if someone was really hurt out there... Okay, I said, grabbing my own gear. But we stick together. No splitting up. We just reached the door when the first impact hit. It was like a battering ram had slammed into the side of the station. The whole building shook, windows rattling in their frames. What the hell? Sarah stumbled, catching herself on the desk. Before I could respond, it came again. Wham! This time I saw the wall actually bow inward from the force. Get away from the windows, I yelled, pulling Sarah towards the center of the room. We huddled there, listening as something massive circled the station. Each impact was accompanied by a sound I hoped to never hear again, a guttural roar that was equal parts rage and hunger. Jack, Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. What is that thing? I shook my head, mind racing. This wasn't a bear, wasn't anything I'd ever encountered in all my years in the wilderness. The attack stopped as suddenly as they'd begun. For a long moment, the only sound was our ragged breathing and the storm raging outside. Then we heard it, a long, drawn-out scraping sound, like claws dragging across the wooden siding of the station. I motioned for Sarah to stay put and crept towards the window, keeping low. Slowly, carefully, I raised my head just enough to peer out into the gloom. What I saw nearly stopped my heart. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, with a build that somehow managed to be both powerfully muscled and unnaturally gaunt. Matted fur covered its body, a mottled grey that seemed to shift and blend with the shadows. But it was the face that would haunt my nightmares for years to come, a muzzle filled with teeth like pointed daggers, eyes that glowed an unholy yellow in the darkness, and an intelligence behind those eyes that had no place in an animal. As I watched, it turned those terrible eyes towards the window. For a heart-stopping moment, I was sure it had seen me. A grin spread across its muzzle, revealing even more of those wicked teeth. I ducked down, pressing my back against the wall, pulse pounding in my ears. "What is it?" Sarah asked. "What did you see?" I opened my mouth, then closed it again. How could I describe the impossible thing lurking just outside? "We need weapons," I said instead. "Anything we can use to defend ourselves." Sarah nodded, her ranger training kicking in despite the fear I could see in her eyes. We did a quick inventory of the station. Our sidearms, of course. A shotgun we kept locked in the safe for emergencies. Flare gun, first aid kit. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. "Should we try to make a run for the trucks?" Sarah asked as I loaded the shotgun. I shook my head. In this storm, in the dark, with that thing out there, we'd never make it. Our best bet is to hunker down and wait for backup. As if it had heard me, the creature chose that moment to renew its assault on the station. The impacts came faster now, more frenzied. I could hear wood splintering, metal groaning. "It's trying to get in," Sarah said, her voice tight with fear. I racked the shotgun. "Then we make it regret that decision." We took up positions on either side of the main door, weapons ready. The thing outside was focusing its attacks there now, each blow threatening to tear the heavy door from its hinges. "Remember your training," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Aim for center mass. And Sarah, don't hesitate. Whatever that thing is, it's not going to stop unless we make it stop." She nodded grimly, adjusting her grip on her sidearm. With a final, thunderous impact, the door burst inward. A blast of cold air and driving rain flooded the station, along with a stench like rotting meat that made my eyes water. For a moment, nothing happened. The doorway remained empty, rain lashing the threshold. Then it appeared. In person, it was even more terrifying than it had been through the window. It filled the entire doorframe, hunched over to fit its massive bulk through the opening. Those yellow's eyes swept the room, finally settling on Sarah and me. It let out a low growl that I felt in my bones, then began to advance. I didn't hesitate. I fired, the shotgun's roar deafening in the confined space. The creature staggered as the blast tore into its chest, letting out a howl of pain and rage, but it didn't go down. "Again!" Sarah yelled, emptying her clip into the monster. I pumped the shotgun and fired again, and again. Each blast drove the thing back a step, black blood oozing from a dozen wounds, but still it came, driven by a hunger that seemed to override all sense of self-preservation. Click! My blood ran cold as the shotgun came up empty. Across the room, I saw Sarah frantically trying to reload her pistol with shaking hands. The creature paused, as if sensing our vulnerability. That terrible grin spread across its muzzle once more. It tensed, preparing to lunge. I raised the now useless shotgun like a club, knowing it would do little good against the monster's bulk. And then, just as it was about to pounce, the most beautiful sound I've ever heard cut through the chaos. Police sirens, growing rapidly closer. The creature's head snapped towards the sound, ears twitching. For the first time, I saw something like uncertainty in those hellish eyes. It turned back to us, letting out a frustrated growl. Then, with one last baleful glare, it spun and bounded back out into the storm. By the time the state police arrived, it was long gone. They found Sarah and me still in the station, surrounded by spent shell casings and splintered wood. The official report blamed the damage on a rogue bear, driven to unusual aggression by the storm and dwindling food supplies. Our descriptions of a wolf-like humanoid were chalked up to fear and adrenaline playing tricks on our minds. But Sarah and I know the truth. We know what's really out there, hiding in the dark spaces of the forest, waiting, hungry. These days, I stick to day shifts and well-traveled trails, and if I hear anything that sounds like claws on wood when I'm out on patrol, well, let's just say I don't go investigating. Because now I know that sometimes the old legends are more than just stories, and I know that out there in the wilderness there are things that defy explanation, things that hunt not just for food, but for the sheer joy of the chase. And God help you if you find yourself in their sights. Story 8. I've been a hunter all my life, tracking everything from white-tailed deer to grizzly bears. But on that fateful day, in the remote wilderness of northern Montana, I learned what it truly means to be prey. When you're face to face with something that shouldn't exist, something that defies everything you thought you knew about the natural world, you realize just how small and vulnerable we humans really are. My name's Frank, and this is the story of how I went from predator to prey in the blink of an eye. It was supposed to be the hunt of a lifetime. I'd heard rumors of a massive bull elk roaming the backcountry, the kind of trophy that taxidermists dream about. The locals called it the ghost, claiming it was too smart, too elusive to ever be taken down. But I was determined to prove them wrong. I'd spent weeks scouting the area, studying maps, and setting up trail cameras. As I hiked into the wilderness that crisp autumn morning, my compound bow slung over my shoulder, I felt more alive than I had in years. This was what I lived for, the thrill of the hunt, man against nature in its purest form. The first 2 days were frustrating. I'd catch glimpses of movement, find massive tracks that had to belong to the ghost, but the elk itself remained maddeningly out of reach. But I was patient. Good hunters always are. It was on the 3rd day that everything changed. I was crouched by a small stream, refilling my water bottle, when I saw it, a track in the soft mud of the bank. My heart raced as I placed my hand next to it for scale. It was easily twice the size of any elk print I'd ever seen. This had to be the ghost. I shouldered my pack and began to follow the trail, my senses on high alert. The tracks led deeper into the forest, into areas so remote they probably hadn't seen a human presence in decades. As the day wore on, a gnawing sense of unease began to grow in the pit of my stomach. Something wasn't right. The forest had gone unnaturally quiet. No bird calls or rustling of small animals, and the tracks, the more I studied them, the less they looked like elk prints. The shape was all wrong, too elongated, with strange claw marks at the tips that no elk could have made, but I pressed on. I'd come too far to turn back now. It was nearing dusk when I entered a small clearing and stopped dead in my tracks. There, in the center of the open space, was a half-eaten elk carcass, and it was massive, easily the size of the ghost I'd been tracking. But it wasn't the size of the elk that made my blood run cold. It was the way it had been killed. No bear or mountain lion could have done this. The carcass looked like it had been torn apart by something with opposable thumbs. The ribcage cracked open like a man might split a lobster shell. I approached cautiously, my bow at the ready. The kill was fresh, couldn't have been more than a few hours old. Whatever had done this could still be nearby. That's when I saw the footprint. A single, massive impression in a patch of bare earth next to the carcass. It was a footprint, a humanoid footprint, but it was over 18 inches long, with clear impressions of wickedly curved claws at the end of each toe. My mind reeled, unable to process what I was seeing. This wasn't possible. There was no animal on Earth that could have left a print like that, unless... No, those were just stories, campfire tales to scare tourists. They couldn't be real. A twig snapped behind me. I whirled around, arrow nocked and drawn in one fluid motion, but there was nothing there, just deepening shadows as the sun sank below the tree line. Another sound off to my left, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. "This isn't funny!" Silence answered me. But I could feel eyes on me. Watching from the darkness between the trees, I was being stalked, sized up like prey. Fear flooded my system, my heart pounding so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I knew better. You never run from a predator. It only triggers their chase response. So I began to back away slowly, keeping my bow drawn and ready. 1 step, 2 steps. Almost to the edge of the clearing, a branch above me creaked. I looked up just in time to see a massive shape hurtling down from the canopy. I fired on pure reflex, my arrow whistling harmlessly past the creature as it landed with earth-shaking force mere feet from where I stood. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My mind struggled to make sense of what I was seeing. It was huge, at least 8 feet tall, with a build that combined the raw power of a grizzly bear with the agility of a mountain lion. Matted fur covered its body, a mottled pattern of browns and greys that would render it nearly invisible in the dappled forest light. Massive arms ended in hands tipped with claws that looked like they could disembowel a man with a single swipe. But it was the face that truly paralyzed me with terror. A sloping forehead and heavy brow ridge gave way to a blunt muzzle filled with teeth that would make a wolf jealous. And the eyes, dear God, the eyes. They glowed with an intelligence that had no place in an animal, filled with a hunger that went beyond mere predatory instinct. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, the old legends made flesh. It let out a roar that shook leaves from the trees, a sound of primal fury that cut straight through to the most primitive part of my brain. Run, that ancient instinct screamed. Run or die. So I ran. I crashed through the underbrush, blind terror driving me forward. Branches whipped at my face. Roots seemed to reach up to trip me. I could hear the creature pursuing, its massive bulk somehow moving through the forest with more silence and grace than I could ever hope to achieve. I don't know how long I ran. Time lost all meaning in that mad flight. But eventually, I burst out of the trees and skidded to a halt at the edge of a sheer cliff. Far below, I could hear the rush of a river over rocks. I was trapped. Heavy footsteps approached from behind. I turned, knowing what I would see, but unable to stop myself. The creature emerged from the tree line, moving with the casual confidence of an apex predator that knows its prey is cornered. It studied me with those terrifyingly intelligent eyes, head cocked to one side, as if puzzled by my presence in its territory. I raised my bow, knowing it was futile, but unable to simply give up. The creature's lips pulled back in what might have been a grin, revealing rows of dagger-like teeth. It took a step forward. I took a step back, feeling loose rocks shift under my feet. Jump, part of my mind whispered. Better a quick death on the rocks than being torn apart by this monstrosity. But before I could move, before the creature could lunge, a new sound cut through the tension. Voices, human voices, carried on the wind from somewhere off to our right. The creature's head snapped towards the sound, nostrils flaring. It let out a low growl of frustration, then turned those burning eyes back to me. For a long moment, we stared at each other. I saw emotions warring in its gaze, hunger, rage, but also something that might have been curiosity or mercy. Then, with a final huff that might have been a warning, it turned and melted back into the forest, as silently as it had appeared. I sank to my knees, legs finally giving out as the adrenaline drained from my system. That's how the search and rescue team found me an hour later. Alerted by the emergency beacon, I'd had the presence of mind to activate during my flight. I told them everything, babbling about monsters and impossible tracks. They exchanged worried glances, clearly thinking I'd lost my mind. The official report blamed my experience on a combination of dehydration, exhaustion, and an encounter with a particularly aggressive bear. But I know the truth. I know what's really out there, hiding in the dark spaces of the wilderness. I know that sometimes the hunter can become the hunted in the blink of an eye. These days, I stick to small game and well-populated hunting grounds. And if I ever hear something moving through the forest with a silence that belies its size, well, let's just say I'm not too proud to turn and run the other way, because now I know that there are things out there that defy explanation, things that turn everything we think we know about nature on its head. And if you're not careful, if you push too far into places humans were never meant to go, you might just find yourself face to face with a nightmare made flesh, a nightmare with hunger in its eyes and your scent in its nostrils. Story 9. I've spent my whole life telling my daughter that there's no such thing as monsters, that the dark is nothing to be afraid of. Now, I'd give anything to go back to a world where that was true. Because once you've heard your child's screams echoing through a moonlit forest, once you've seen the thing that took her, you realize that some childhood fears are terrifyingly real. My name's David, and this is the story of the night my family's camping trip turned into a waking nightmare. It was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway. My wife Karen, our 8-year-old daughter Lily, and I had been planning this trip to Timber Creek Campground for months. A chance to unplug, to reconnect with nature and each other. Lily had been so excited, chattering non-stop about roasting marshmallows and telling ghost stories around the campfire. If only I'd known what was waiting for us in those woods. We arrived at the campground late Friday afternoon. The place was pretty deserted, just a handful of other campers scattered around the sprawling site. The ranger at the check-in booth had mentioned something about unseasonably cold weather, keeping the crowds away. At the time, I was grateful for the solitude. Now, I wish we'd been surrounded by people. We found our spot and set up camp, Lily helping by holding the tent poles and getting tangled in the guy lines. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the towering pines, we gathered around our campfire for dinner. "Dad, did you remember the marshmallows?" Lily asked, her eyes wide with anticipation. I made a show of patting my pockets. "Marshmallows? Was I supposed to bring marshmallows?" Her face fell, and I quickly pulled the bag from behind my back. "Just kidding, sweetheart. I'd never forget the most important camping supply." Her delighted giggles filled the air as we roasted marshmallows and made s'mores. Looking back, I tried to focus on that moment. My daughter's smile illuminated by firelight, the taste of chocolate and graham crackers, the warmth of Karen leaning against my side. I tried to remember the happiness before everything went to hell. As the fire died down to embers, we crawled into our tent. Lily snuggled between Karen and me in our big family-sized sleeping bag, her stuffed wolf clutched tightly to her chest. "Daddy," she whispered as I was drifting off, "what if there are monsters in the woods?" I smiled in the darkness, giving her a reassuring squeeze. "There's no such thing as monsters, sweetie. Just remember what I always tell you. The dark might hide things, but it can't create them. Anything out there in the night was there in the daytime too. There's nothing to be afraid of." God, how wrong I was. I'm not sure what woke me. Some animal sound, maybe, or just that sixth sense that tells you something isn't right. I blinked awake, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. The tent was bathed in pale moonlight, strong enough to see by even through the nylon walls. I reached out, a lifetime of parental instinct driving me to check on Lily. My hand met empty space where she should have been. "Lily," I whispered, not wanting to wake Karen. No response. I sat up, fully awake now. Lily's side of the sleeping bag was empty, her stuffed wolf lying abandoned on her pillow. She must have gotten up to use the bathroom. I unzipped the tent, as quietly as I could, and stepped out into the chilly night air. The campground was silent, save for the gentle rustle of wind through the pines. "Lily," I called, a little louder this time. "Sweetheart, where are you?" Nothing. A tendril of fear began to curl in my gut. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam around our campsite. No sign of her. "Lily!" Real panic was creeping into my voice now. "David, what's going on?" Karen's sleepy voice came from inside the tent. "Lily's not here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm sure she just went to the bathroom. I'm going to go check." I heard Karen scrambling to get up as I headed towards the campground's central facilities. My pace quickened with each step, the beam of my flashlight dancing crazily across the path. The bathrooms were empty. By the time I got back to our campsite, Karen was up and frantically calling Lily's name. I could see the terror in her eyes, knew it was mirrored in my own. "I'm going to check the other campsites," I said, grabbing the car keys. "And you stay here in case she comes back?" I drove through the campground, stopping at each occupied site to wake the inhabitants and ask if they'd seen a little girl. No one had. I was about to head back to our site when I saw it, a flash of pink fabric caught on a bush near the trailhead that led deeper into the forest. My heart stopped. It was a piece of Lily's pajamas. I was out of the car in an instant, shouting for help as I plunged down the trail. Other campers were emerging from their tents now, confused and alarmed by the commotion. I heard someone say they were calling the ranger station, but I couldn't wait. My little girl was out there somewhere, alone and afraid. I crashed through the underbrush, my flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. "Lily!" I screamed. "Lily, can you hear me?" And then, carried on the wind, I heard it. A scream. Lily's scream. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. The screams were getting louder, punctuated by terrified sobs. "Daddy! Daddy! Help me!" I burst into a small clearing and skidded to a halt, my brain struggling to process what I was seeing. Lily was there, backed up against a massive oak tree, but looming over her, blocking any escape, was something. Something huge, something impossible. It was vaguely humanoid, but far too large, 8, maybe 9 feet tall. Shaggy fur covered its body, matted and tangled with twigs and leaves. Massive arms ended in hands tipped with wicked claws. But it was the face that sent ice water flooding through my veins. A sloping forehead and heavy brow ridge gave way to a blunt muzzle filled with teeth that would make a wolf jealous. And the eyes, dear God, the eyes. They glowed with an unholy yellow light, filled with an intelligence that had no place in an animal. As I watched, frozen in terror, it reached for Lily with one of those massive, clawed hands. "No!" The word tore from my throat before I could think. I lunged forward, putting myself between the monster and my daughter. The creature reared back, startled by my sudden appearance. It let out a roar that shook leaves from the trees, a sound of primal fury that cut straight through to the most primitive part of my brain. "Run!" That ancient instinct screamed, "Run or die." But I couldn't run, not without Lily. I grabbed a fallen branch, brandishing it like a club. "Stay back!" I yelled, trying to sound braver than I felt. "Don't come any closer." The thing cocked its head, studying me with those terrifying eyes. I saw emotions warring in its gaze, hunger, rage, but also something that might have been curiosity or amusement. It took a step forward. I swung the branch, connecting solidly with its shoulder. It might as well have been a toothpick for all the good it did. The creature didn't even flinch. This was it, I thought. We were going to die here, torn apart by something that shouldn't exist. And then, like an answer to a prayer I hadn't even had time to form, I heard voices, human voices coming closer. Flashlight beams cut through the trees. The creature's head snapped towards the sound. It let out a low growl of frustration, then turned those burning eyes back to us. For a long moment we stared at each other. I saw the hunger there, the primal urge to hunt, but I also saw hesitation. Then, with a final huff that might have been a warning, it turned and melted into the forest as silently as it had appeared. I scooped Lily into my arms, holding her tight as she sobbed into my shoulder. Moments later, the clearing was flooded with people. Park rangers, other campers, search and rescue teams that had been mobilized with impressive speed. They found us like that, clinging to each other in the middle of the woods. Lily babbled about the big, hairy monster, but the adults exchanged knowing glances over her head. Poor kid. Their eyes seemed to say, "Must have had a nightmare and sleepwalked out here." But I knew the truth. I had seen it with my own eyes. The official report blamed Lily's disappearance on sleepwalking and our shared hallucination on some kind of swamp gas. They said the claw marks on the trees were from bears. But I know what's really out there, hiding in the dark spaces of the forest. I know that sometimes childhood monsters are terrifyingly real. These days, we stick to vacations in the city, and if Lily says she's afraid of the dark, well, I don't tell her there's nothing to fear anymore. Instead, I check under the bed and in the closet every single night, because now I know that there are things out there that defy explanation. Things that turn everything we think we know about the world on its head. And sometimes those things come out of the forest with hunger in their eyes and the scent of your child in their nostrils. Story 10. I never should have gone hiking alone. That's what everyone tells you, right? But I've been an experienced solo hiker for years, and the Appalachian Trail was like a second home to me. At least, that's what I thought before that day in late October when everything changed. The crisp autumn air nipped at my cheeks as I adjusted my backpack straps, taking in the vibrant reds and golds of the forest around me. I'd been on the trail for 3 days, relishing the solitude and the rhythm of my boots crunching through fallen leaves. The weather forecast promised clear skies, perfect for my planned 5-day trek through a particularly remote section of the trail in Georgia. As the sun began its descent behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the path, I first noticed the sound. At first, I thought it was just an echo of my own footsteps bouncing off the rocky hillside, but something felt off. The cadence was slightly different, just out of sync with my own pace. I paused, holding my breath to listen. Silence. Shaking my head, I chuckled at my own paranoia. "Get it together, Sarah," I muttered, resuming my hike. But as I started walking again, there it was, the unmistakable sound of something large moving through the underbrush, matching my pace almost exactly. My heart rate quickened as I picked up speed, ears straining for any clue as to what might be following me. A bear, maybe. But bears don't usually stalk hikers like this. Mountain lion. No, the footfalls sounded heavier, more deliberate. I reached for the bear spray on my hip, comforted by its presence even as my mind raced through increasingly unlikely scenarios. Whatever it was keeping its distance, always just out of sight, beyond the dense foliage flanking the trail. As darkness fell, my planned campsite still a mile ahead, the dread in the pit of my stomach grew. The footsteps behind me never ceased, never fell behind. If anything, they seemed to be getting closer. I broke into a jog, my backpack jostling uncomfortably as I pushed myself harder than I had in years. The sound behind me quickened to match, panic rising in my throat. I sprinted the last quarter mile to the clearing where I'd intended to make camp. Gasping for breath, hands shaking, I fumbled with my tent poles. Every snapping twig and rustling leaf sent jolts of adrenaline through my body. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As I drove the last stake into the ground, a twig snapped loudly just beyond the tree line. I whirled around, fumbling for my headlamp. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but gently swaying branches. "Hello!" I called out, my voice embarrassingly shaky. "Is someone there?" Only the whisper of wind through leaves answered me. I retreated to my tent, zipping myself in and curling up in my sleeping bag. Sleep was impossible. Every sound outside seemed amplified. The hoot of an owl, the scurrying of some small animal, and was that breathing? Deep, ragged breathing, just on the other side of the thin nylon wall. I clutched my hunting knife, the metal cool against my sweaty palm. Hours passed, each minute an eternity as I strained my ears for any sign of danger. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted into a fitful sleep filled with dreams of being chased through endless dark forests. I jolted awake to birdsong and early morning light filtering through my tent. For a moment, I felt silly about my fears from the night before. But as I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, my blood ran cold. Surrounding my campsite in a wide circle were footprints. Huge footprints, easily twice the size of my own boots, pressed deep into the soft earth. They were unmistakably bipedal, with 5 toes clearly visible in some of the clearer impressions. but no human could have left tracks like these. My hands trembling, I approached the nearest tree at the edge of the clearing. Deep grooves were carved into the bark, about 7 feet off the ground, claw marks. Whatever had been stalking me, it was big, it was strong, and it had been right here, watching me sleep. I broke camp in record time, shoving gear haphazardly into my pack. My only thought was to get back to civilization as quickly as possible. I hit the trail at a near run, constantly looking over my shoulder. The day passed in a blur of paranoia and exhaustion. Every squirrel sent my heart racing. Every shadow looked like a monstrous figure ready to pounce. But the footsteps didn't return, and slowly I began to calm down. As the sun dipped low once again, I knew I had a choice to make. The next shelter was still miles away. There was no way I'd make it before dark. I could try to push through the night, but the risk of injury on the rocky trail was high. Or I could make camp again, here in this little clearing just off the main path. "You're being ridiculous," I told myself firmly. "There's nothing out here that isn't usually in these woods. You've just spooked yourself." I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and tried to convince myself that the events of the previous night had been a product of an overactive imagination. As darkness fell, I built a small fire, hoping its cheerful crackling would keep any lurking fears at bay. I was just starting to relax, poking at the embers with a stick, when I heard it. A long, low howl echoed through the trees, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't a wolf or a coyote. It was deeper, more guttural, almost human, but not quite. The fire suddenly felt very small, its warmth doing nothing to dispel the chill that ran down my spine. I grabbed my knife and bear spray, holding them close as my eyes darted from shadow to shadow. The howl came again, closer this time. It was answered by another, off to my left, then another behind me. 3 of them. Oh God! I scrambled into my tent, zipping it shut as if that flimsy barrier could offer any real protection. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as I strained my ears for any sound of approach. Wood snapped nearby, something heavy moving through the underbrush. I could hear deep, rumbling breaths, like a large animal scenting the air. My whole body trembled as I realized the creature was circling my tent. A shadow fell across the tent wall, backlit by my dying campfire. It was enormous, at least 8 feet tall, with a bulky, powerful silhouette. I clamped a hand over my mouth to stifle a scream as I watched a massive, clawed hand reach towards the tent zipper. Time seemed to stop. I was certain these were my final moments, that I would be torn apart by whatever nightmare creature lurked just inches away. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the attack, but it never came. After what felt like hours, I cautiously opened my eyes. The shadow was gone. The forest had fallen silent except for the faint popping of the last embers in my fire pit. I didn't sleep a wink that night. As soon as the first hint of dawn lightened the sky, I burst out of my tent, ready to run. But what I saw stopped me in my tracks. My campsite was surrounded by a ring of tall, intricate stick structures. They looked almost like crosses, with smaller sticks bound to them in complex patterns. Hanging from each one were clumps of long, coarse hair, dark brown, almost black. I approached one cautiously, my hand shaking as I reached out to touch the hanging hair. It was thick and wiry, definitely not human, but not quite like any animal fur I'd encountered before. My gaze fell to the ground, and I saw them again. Those massive footprints, now accompanied by clear handprints where the creature had crouched to construct its bizarre totems. What did they mean? Was it a warning, a territory marker? I didn't stick around to find out. I left my tent behind, grabbing only my most essential gear before hitting the trail at a dead sprint. I didn't stop running until I reached the nearest road, where a startled day hiker gave me a ride to the nearest ranger station. I told them everything, expecting disbelief or mockery. But the rangers exchanged knowing glances as I described the footprints, the howls, the stick structures. They'd heard similar stories before, it seemed, though few as detailed as mine. They took samples of the hair I'd brought and promised to investigate. I'd like to say that was the end of it, that I wrote it off as a strange experience and went back to my normal life. But the truth is, I've never been the same since that night on the trail. I still hike, still camp, but never alone. And on dark nights when the wind whistles through the trees, I can't help but listen for those footsteps, following just behind me in the darkness. Story 11. I've been a park ranger for 15 years, and I thought I'd seen it all, but nothing could have prepared me for that night in the Ozarks. It started with the howls, unearthly sounds that made even the most hardened hunters pack up and leave. Little did I know, those howls were just the beginning. The call came in on a crisp October evening. I was finishing up some paperwork when my radio crackled to life. "Mike, you there? We've got another report of those weird noises out by Crow's Creek. Think you can check it out?" I sighed, rubbing my eyes. It was the third such call this week. "Copy that. Dispatch. I'm on my way." I grabbed my gear and headed out to my truck. The sun was already dipping below the tree line, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Any other day, I'd have taken a moment to appreciate the view, but tonight there was an odd tension in the air that set my teeth on edge. The drive to Crow's Creek was uneventful, but as I neared the area, I noticed something strange. The usual nighttime sounds of the forest, the chirping of crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, were conspicuously absent. It was as if the entire wood was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I parked at the trailhead and grabbed my flashlight and camera. Standard procedure was to document any unusual findings, though I expected this to be another wild goose chase. Probably just some coyotes getting rowdy, I thought to myself as I started down the trail. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the path ahead. I'd hiked this trail countless times, but tonight it felt different, unfamiliar. The shadows seemed deeper, the silence more oppressive. About a mile in, I came across the first sign that something was amiss. A young deer lay in a clearing, its body torn open from throat to belly. This was no ordinary predator kill. The carcass hadn't been eaten, just destroyed. I snapped a few photos, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling growing in my gut. That's when I heard it. A low, mournful howl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever encountered in these woods. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as the howl was answered by another, then another. They were surrounding me. I radioed back to base. "Dispatch, this is Mike. I'm hearing those sounds the hikers reported. Definitely not coyotes. I've also found evidence of unusual predator activity, requesting backup." Static was my only reply. "Dispatch, do you copy?" Nothing but more static. Great. I decided to press on, my curiosity overriding my better judgment. As I moved deeper into the woods, I came across more carcasses, rabbits, foxes, even a black bear, all mutilated in the same way as the deer. I documented everything, my camera flash briefly illuminating the gruesome scenes. The howls continued, sometimes so close I could have sworn they were right behind me. But every time I turned around, my flashlight beam revealed nothing but trees and underbrush. After about an hour of this nerve-wracking investigation, I decided I had enough evidence to warrant a full team search in the morning. I turned back towards the trailhead, walking faster than I'd like to admit. That's when I saw it, just for a second, caught in the beam of my flashlight, a pair of eyes reflecting back at me, not the usual yellow or green eyeshine of a nocturnal animal. These eyes glowed an unnatural, almost electric blue, and they were far too high off the ground to belong to any normal forest dweller. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The eyes blinked once, then vanished. A low growl rumbled through the trees, setting every nerve in my body on edge. "Hello!" I called out, immediately regretting it. My voice sounded pitifully small in the vast darkness of the forest. "This is Park Ranger Mike Harding. Identify yourself." The only response was another howl, so close it made my ears ring. I broke into a run, all thoughts of professional composure forgotten. Branches whipped at my face as I sprinted down the trail, the sounds of heavy footfalls and snapping twigs close behind me. I burst out of the tree line into the parking lot, fumbling for my truck keys. As I slammed the door shut and started the engine, I caught a glimpse of something in my rearview mirror, a large, shadowy figure at the edge of the woods, standing upright but not quite human. In the moment before I sped away, I could have sworn I saw those glowing blue eyes again. The drive back to the ranger station was a blur. My hands shook as I parked the truck and stumbled inside. My colleague, Sarah, took one look at my pale face and scratched up arms and sat me down with a cup of strong coffee. "Mike, what happened out there? You look like you've seen a ghost." I shook my head, trying to gather my thoughts. "I'm not sure what I saw, Sarah, but something's out there, something big." I filled her in on the mutilated animals, the howls, and the glowing eyes. To her credit, Sarah listened without interruption, her expression growing more concerned with each detail. "We need to get a team out there at first light," I finished. "Whatever's doing this, it's dangerous." Sarah nodded, already reaching for the phone to start making calls. "What about your photos? Did you get anything we can use to identify this creature?" I'd almost forgotten about the camera in my haste to escape the woods. I pulled it out, hands still trembling slightly as I turned it on and began scrolling through the images. Mutilated deer, click, torn-up rabbit, click, disemboweled bear, click, trees, click, more trees, click. I froze, my blood running cold. There, in a photo I didn't remember taking, was a face. Not human, not quite animal, peering out from behind a tree. The snout was too long, the teeth too sharp, and the eyes, those same glowing blue eyes I'd seen in the forest, stared directly into the camera. "Sarah," I managed to croak out, "you need to see this." She came around the desk, leaning in to look at the camera's small screen. Her sharp intake of breath told me I wasn't hallucinating. What the hell is that thing, Mike?" I shook my head, at a loss for words. In all my years as a ranger, I'd never seen anything like it. The face in the photo seemed to be an impossible mix of wolf and human, with an intelligence in its eyes that sent shivers down my spine. "I don't know," I admitted, "but we need to find out fast." We spent the rest of the night making phone calls to other rangers, to local law enforcement, even to a biology professor at the nearby university. By dawn, we had assembled a search team, armed with tranquilizer guns and plenty of cameras. As we geared up to head back into the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were in over our heads. The creature in the photo, whatever it was, didn't belong in our world of carefully marked trails and campsite regulations. It was something older, wilder, a reminder that for all our technology and knowledge, there are still things in this world beyond our understanding. The rising sun painted the sky pink as our convoy of trucks made its way back to Crow's Creek. The forest looked different in the daylight, less menacing, but no less mysterious. As we unloaded our gear and prepared to enter the woods, I found myself hoping we wouldn't find anything, that somehow the horrors of the night before had been a product of my imagination. But deep down, I knew better. Those glowing eyes and unearthly howls were burned into my memory, and as our team spread out to begin our search, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't the hunters here. We were the prey. The forest seemed to watch us as we moved deeper into its shadows. Every snapping twig made us jump, every rustling leaf had us spinning around, weapons raised. But hour after hour passed with no sign of the creature from my photograph. It wasn't until late afternoon that we found something. One of the younger rangers, a guy named Tom, called out from a dense thicket of underbrush. "Guys, you need to see this." We converged on his position, pushing through the thick foliage. What we found stopped us all in our tracks. A clearing, maybe 30 feet across, was filled with bones, animal bones of all sizes, from tiny rodents to what looked like deer and even a few bears, were arranged in intricate, almost artistic patterns across the forest floor. "What the hell?" Sarah breathed, her face pale. I knelt down to examine the nearest arrangement. The bones were old, bleached white by sun and time, but the patterns they formed were unmistakably deliberate. This wasn't the work of scavengers or natural decay. Something, or someone, had created this macabre display. "Everyone, grab your cameras," I ordered, my voice steadier than I felt. "Document everything. And stay alert." As the team spread out to photograph the bone arrangements, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I found myself constantly scanning the tree line, half expecting to see those glowing blue eyes staring back at me. We were so focused on the bones that we almost missed it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The team froze, hands tightening on weapons. "Nobody move," I whispered, my eyes darting from tree to tree. For a long moment, the forest was absolutely silent. Then, just at the edge of the clearing, something moved. A shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness beneath the trees. It was huge, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, and covered in dark, shaggy fur. As it stepped into a patch of sunlight, I felt my heart skip a beat. It was the creature from my photo, but seeing it in person was a whole different level of terrifying. Its face was a nightmarish blend of wolf and human, with a powerful, elongated jaw filled with gleaming teeth. But it was the eyes that held me transfixed. That same unnatural blue, filled with an intelligence that had no place in an animal's gaze. For a heartbeat that seemed to last an eternity, the creature stared at us. I could almost see the wheels turning behind those glowing eyes, assessing us, deciding whether we were a threat or merely an inconvenience. Then, faster than anything that size should be able to move, it was gone. The undergrowth rustled, and the sound of heavy footfalls faded into the distance. We stood there, frozen in shock and fear, for what felt like hours. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. Please tell me someone got a picture of that thing." Hands shaking, we checked our cameras, but every photo taken in those last few moments showed nothing but empty forest. Whatever that creature was, it clearly didn't want to be documented. As we made our way back to the ranger station, our excitement at the discovery warred with a deep, primal fear. We had stumbled onto something that defied explanation, something that shouldn't exist in our rational, modern world. I knew we'd be back, with more people, more equipment, determined to solve the mystery of what lurked in these woods. But as I looked out the window at the darkening forest, a part of me hoped we'd never find it again. Some things, I realized, are better left undiscovered. And as the last light faded from the sky, I could have sworn I heard a familiar howl echoing through the trees, a sound that would haunt my dreams for years to come. Story 12. I've captured images of every animal native to the Pacific Northwest, or so I thought. But on that foggy morning in the Cascade Mountains, I realized how little I truly knew about the creatures that call these forests home. The day started like any other wildlife photography expedition. I'd hiked deep into the backcountry, miles from the nearest trail, searching for the perfect shot of a family of black bears I'd been tracking for weeks. My camp was simple, just a small one-person tent and the bare essentials. Out here it was just me, my camera, and the wilderness. I awoke before dawn, the air inside my tent crisp and damp. As I unzipped the flap and poked my head out, I was greeted by a wall of fog so thick I could barely see 10 feet in front of me. Perfect conditions for catching animals unaware, I thought, grinning to myself as I grabbed my gear. The forest was eerily silent as I made my way through the underbrush, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of moss and pine needles. Tendrils of mist curled around ancient tree trunks, giving the woods an almost dreamlike quality. I paused every few minutes, listening intently for any sign of movement. That's when I heard it, a sound that didn't belong in these woods. A rhythmic knocking, like wood striking wood, echoed through the fog. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. Intrigued, I changed course, moving as quietly as I could towards the source of the sound. As I drew closer, I began to make out other noises, the snapping of twigs, the rustle of something large moving through the undergrowth. My heart raced with excitement. Could this be the bear family I'd been tracking? I raised my camera, ready to capture whatever emerged from the mist. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. Tap, 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 tap. Whatever was making that sound, it was big. Suddenly, the fog ahead seemed to part, and a dark shape emerged. I instinctively pressed the shutter button, my camera's rapid-fire clicks breaking the silence. As the figure came into focus, my finger froze on the button, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. It wasn't a bear. The creature stood upright on two legs, easily 7 or 8 feet tall. Its body was covered in long, matted hair, somewhere between dark brown and black. But it was the face that sent ice through my veins. Not quite human, not quite ape. A blend of features that shouldn't exist outside of folklore and campfire stories. For a moment that felt like an eternity, we stared at each other. Those eyes, deep-set and startlingly intelligent, bored into me with an intensity I'd never experienced from any animal. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as my brain screamed that this couldn't be real. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the creature turned and melted back into the fog, the spell broken. I suddenly realized I was holding my breath and gasped for air. My hands shook as I clutched my camera, my only proof that I hadn't imagined the whole encounter. I stumbled back to my campsite in a daze, my mind racing. What had I just seen? Some undiscovered species of primate, a person in an incredibly realistic costume, or could it be... No, I refused to even think the word. Sasquatch was a myth, a legend, wasn't it? As I reached my tent, a new sound froze me in my tracks. Wood knocking, just like before, but this time from multiple directions. Tap, tap, tap to my left. Tap, 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 tap behind me. A chorus of knocks surrounding my small clearing. My heart pounded as I realized I wasn't alone. Far from it. Whatever I had encountered, there were more of them out there, hidden in the mist, and they had me surrounded. I dove into my tent, zipping it shut as if that flimsy barrier could offer any real protection. My hands trembled as I fumbled with my camera, desperate to see the photos I had taken. The first few shots showed nothing but fog and trees, but then, there it was. The creature, caught mid-stride as it emerged from the mist. The image was slightly blurry, but unmistakable. Long arms, powerful hunched shoulders, that face, God, that face, a mix of human and something else entirely. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the photo, undeniable proof that I wasn't going crazy. The knocking outside grew louder, more insistent. I could hear movement now, heavy footsteps circling my tent, branches snapping under significant weight. They were so close. What did they want? Were they curious, angry that I had seen them, or hungry? I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed with fear, as the creatures moved around my campsite. Hours, maybe. The fog began to lift as morning turned to afternoon, sunlight filtering through the trees. Gradually, the knocking and movement faded, replaced by the normal sounds of the forest. Still, I waited, ears straining for any sign that they were still out there. It wasn't until my growling stomach finally overpowered my fear that I cautiously unzipped the tent and peeked outside. My campsite was undisturbed, looking exactly as I had left it the night before. But as I emerged fully from the tent, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Footprints. Massive, human-like footprints pressed deep into the damp earth, circling my tent. Some were so close I could have reached out and touched them from where I'd been sitting. I grabbed my camera and began documenting everything. The footprints, broken branches high up in the surrounding trees, far too high for any normal animal to reach. And there, hanging from a nearby pine, a clump of long, coarse hair caught on the rough bark. As I photographed the hair, a twig snapped in the distance. I whirled around, camera at the ready, and caught a glimpse of something large moving through the trees. Click, click, click. I fired off a rapid succession of shots before whatever it was disappeared from view. My hands shook as I reviewed the images. Most were just a blur of motion, but one stopped my heart. A face, unmistakably the same as the creature I'd seen earlier, peering out from behind a massive Douglas fir. Those eyes staring directly into my lens. I knew in that moment that I had stumbled onto something extraordinary, something that would change everything we thought we knew about the natural world. But as I stood there, surrounded by evidence of creatures that shouldn't exist, a creeping doubt began to set in. What would happen if I shared these photos? Would I be hailed as the person who finally proved the existence of Bigfoot? Or would I be labeled a fraud? My career as a wildlife photographer destroyed by claims of an elaborate hoax. And what about the creatures themselves? If their existence was proven, what would that mean for them? Would their habitat be protected? Or would they be hounded by scientists and thrill-seekers, their peaceful existence in these mountains shattered forever? The weight of the decision pressed down on me as I began to pack up my camp. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump, certain that the creatures were watching me, waiting to see what I would do with the knowledge they had allowed me to glimpse. As I shouldered my backpack and took one last look around the clearing, I made my choice. The memory card from my camera felt heavy in my pocket as I began the long hike back to civilization. I had the proof the world had been waiting for. But was the world ready for it? The hike out was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every so often, I'd catch a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye or hear that distinctive wood knocking in the distance. They were escorting me out of their territory, I realized, making sure I left, or perhaps making sure I was allowed to leave. As I neared the trailhead, the sounds faded away. The presence I'd felt watching over me receded, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the weight of my discovery. I reached my car just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the nearly empty parking lot. As I tossed my gear into the trunk, a glint of something caught my eye. There, stuck to my windshield wiper, was a single long, dark hair, a message, a warning, or perhaps a gift, a small piece of proof to accompany my photographs. I carefully placed it in a small plastic bag, my mind already racing with the possibilities. As I started the long drive home, I knew my life would never be the same. I had seen something few humans had ever witnessed, and I had the evidence to prove it. But as the mountains receded in my rearview mirror, I found myself wondering if some mysteries were better left unsolved. The memory card sat heavy in my pocket, filled with images that could change the world. But as I remembered those intelligent eyes staring into my camera lens, I knew the decision of what to do with those photos wouldn't be an easy one. For now, at least, the secret of the Mistwalkers would remain safe with me, and somewhere deep in the forests of the Pacific Northwest, I knew they would be watching, waiting to see what I would do next. Story 13. The crack of the rifle echoed through the forest, but it wasn't our shot. My son Tommy and I exchanged a confused glance. We were miles from the nearest hunting group. As the sound faded, replaced by an unnatural silence, I realized our father-son trip was about to become something I could never have prepared for. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. Tommy had just turned 16, old enough for his first real hunting trip in the dense forests of northern Michigan. I'd been coming to this same spot since I was his age, taught by my own father. Now it was my turn to pass on the tradition. We'd set up camp in a small clearing, our tent nestled between two ancient oaks. The afternoon had been spent tracking a promising set of deer trails, and we were feeling optimistic about our chances for the next morning's hunt. As the sun dipped below the tree line, casting long shadows across our campsite, I busied myself with building a fire while Tommy sorted through our gear. The crisp October air nipped at our cheeks, carrying with it the earthy scent of decaying leaves and pine. "You dad," Tommy called out, his voice tinged with excitement. "Check this out." I looked up from the kindling I was arranging to see him pointing at something just beyond our clearing. Following his gaze, I spotted what had caught his attention. A set of tracks pressed into a patch of soft earth. Curious, I made my way over to take a closer look. My first thought was bear. The impressions were large and showed clear claw marks. But as I knelt down to examine them more closely, something felt off. "What do you think, Dad? Black bear?" Tommy asked, crouching beside me. I frowned, tracing the outline of the print with my finger. "I'm not sure, Bud. It's big for a black bear, and the shape is strange." The track was elongated, almost human-like in its proportions, but much larger than any human foot I'd ever seen. And those claw marks, they were longer and sharper than a bear's should be. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cooling evening air. "Let's get back to the campfire," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "It's probably nothing, but we should keep an eye out." As darkness fell, we huddled around the fire, roasting hot dogs and sharing stories. I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often than I'd like to admit, unable to shake the uneasy feeling those tracks had given me. It was nearing midnight when we heard it, a long, mournful howl that echoed through the trees. Tommy's eyes went wide. "Wolves," he whispered, excitement and fear mingling in his voice. I shook my head slowly. I'd heard wolves before, and this was something different. The sound was deeper, more guttural, with an almost human quality that set my teeth on edge. "Probably just coyotes," I lied, forcing a smile. "Nothing to worry about. We should get some sleep if we want to be up before dawn." We retreated to our tent, but sleep didn't come easily. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves had me on high alert. Tommy, exhausted from the day's hike, fell into a fitful sleep, but I lay awake, straining my ears for any sign of danger. It was just past 3 a.m. when I heard it. Heavy footsteps circling our campsite. My hand instinctively reached for the rifle we'd brought for hunting, my heart pounding so loud I was sure whatever was out there could hear it. The footsteps paused just outside our tent. I held my breath, willing Tommy not to wake up and make a sound. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing but silence. Then a low, rumbling growl vibrated through the air. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before, not quite animal, not quite human. Before I could react, the side of our tent caved in as something massive pressed against it. I stifled a yell, grabbing Tommy and shaking him awake. His eyes flew open, confusion quickly turning to fear as he took in my panicked expression and the deformed shape of our tent. "Dad, what's—" I clamped a hand over his mouth, shaking my head frantically. Whatever was out there, I didn't want it to know we were awake. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the pressure on the tent eased. The footsteps resumed, moving away from us and deeper into the forest. Only when the sound had faded completely did I release the breath I'd been holding. "What was that?" Tommy whispered, his voice shaking. "I don't know," I admitted, "but we need to get out of here. Now." We packed up as quietly as we could, shoving gear haphazardly into our backpacks. The forest around us seemed alive with tension, as if every tree and bush was watching our frantic preparation. Just as we were about to leave the clearing, a blood-curdling scream split the night. It was close, too close, and filled with a mixture of rage and pain that made my blood run cold. "Run!" I yelled, all thoughts of stealth forgotten. We crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at our faces as we ran blindly through the dark forest. I could hear something moving behind us, keeping pace effortlessly despite the difficult terrain. "There," Tommy gasped, pointing ahead. A fallen tree loomed in the gloom, its massive trunk creating a natural barrier. Without hesitation, we dove behind it, pressing our backs against the rough bark. For a moment, all I could hear was our ragged breathing and the pounding of blood in my ears. Then, the sound of heavy footsteps approaching our hiding spot. I raised my rifle, though I knew in my heart it would be little use against whatever was hunting us. Tommy pressed close to my side, his entire body trembling. The footsteps stopped just on the other side of the log. A low, curious grunt reached my ears, followed by the sound of sniffing. It was scenting us out. I tightened my grip on the rifle, finger hovering near the trigger. Tommy, I whispered, so quietly I could barely hear myself. When I say run, you run. Don't look back, don't wait for me. Just run for the truck, understand? He nodded, tears streaming down his face. The creature let out another grunt. Closer now, I could hear twigs snapping under its weight as it began to circle the log. This was it, now or never. Run! I shouted, standing up and firing a warning shot into the air. Tommy took off like a shot, crashing through the underbrush. I turned to follow, but what I saw froze me in place. There, illuminated by the muzzle flash, stood a creature straight out of a nightmare. It was massive, easily 7 feet tall, with a body covered in dark, matted fur. But it was the face that would haunt me for years to come. Not quite wolf, not quite human, a horrifying blend of features that should not exist in nature. For a heartbeat that felt like an eternity, we stared at each other. Its eyes, glowing an unnatural amber in the darkness, held an intelligence that sent shivers down my spine. The spell was broken by Tommy's voice, calling out from somewhere ahead. "Dad, come on!" I ran harder than I'd ever run in my life, my lungs burning as I crashed through the forest. I could hear the creature behind me, its heavy footfalls getting closer with each passing second. Just when I thought my legs would give out, I burst through the tree line into the small clearing where we'd parked. Tommy was already in the truck, the engine running. "Go!" I yelled as I dove into the passenger seat. "Drive!" Tommy slammed on the gas, the truck's tires spinning in the loose dirt before finding purchase. We fishtailed onto the narrow forest road, the vehicle bouncing wildly as Tommy pushed it to its limits. I twisted in my seat, peering out the rear window. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood the creature. As we sped away, I could have sworn I saw it raise a hand, a terrifyingly human-like gesture of farewell. We drove in silence for miles, the first rays of dawn painting the sky when Tommy finally spoke. "Dad," he said, his voice hoarse. What was that thing?" I shook my head, still struggling to process what we'd encountered. "I don't know, son. I really don't know." As we merged onto the highway, leaving the forest far behind, I knew our lives would never be the same. We had glimpsed something that defied explanation, something that shouldn't exist in our rational, modern world. I looked over at Tommy, his knuckles still white on the steering wheel, and made a decision. Let's keep this between us, okay? No one would believe us anyway. He nodded, a silent understanding passing between us. We had survived, but at the cost of our innocence. The world was a bigger, stranger place than we had ever imagined. As the sun rose fully, chasing away the last shadows of our terrifying night, I found myself wondering how many other secrets did those ancient forests hold, and how long could they remain hidden in a world that was quickly running out of mysteries. One thing was certain, our days of hunting in those woods were over. Some creatures, I realized, were never meant to be prey, and sometimes the hunter can all too easily become the hunted. Story 14. I've been camping in the Sierra Nevada mountains for over 2 decades, but nothing could have prepared me for that night. It wasn't the bears or mountain lions that nearly cost us our lives. It was something far more ancient, something that shouldn't exist outside of legend. Our group of 4 had been planning this trip for months. Me, my wife Sarah, and our friends Mike and Lisa, all experienced campers with a shared love for the rugged beauty of the high country. We'd chosen a remote spot, miles from the nearest maintained trail, hoping to escape the summer crowds and truly immerse ourselves in the wilderness. The first 2 days were perfect. We hiked through pristine alpine meadows, fished in crystal-clear streams, and spent our evenings around the campfire, sharing stories and marveling at the riot of stars overhead. It felt like we had the entire mountain range to ourselves. On the 3rd night, everything changed. I was jolted awake by a crash outside our tent, followed by Sarah's sharp intake of breath beside me. "What was that?" she whispered, clutching my arm. "Probably just a curious bear," I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. We'd taken all the proper precautions, hanging our food cache high in a tree well away from our campsite. But animals could be unpredictable, especially this far from civilization. Another crash, louder this time, had us both sitting up. I fumbled for the flashlight we kept by our sleeping bags, my heart racing. As the beam cut through the darkness, I caught a glimpse of something large moving just beyond the thin nylon walls of our tent. "Hey!" I called out, hoping my voice sounded authoritative enough to scare off whatever was out there. "Get out of here!" For a moment, silence fell over the campsite. Then, a sound that made my blood run cold, a deep, guttural growl that was like nothing I'd ever heard before. Not a bear, not a mountain lion. This was something else. What the hell was that? Sarah gasped, her voice barely above a whisper. Before I could answer, our tent was suddenly illuminated from outside. Mike's voice rang out, tight with fear. "Guys, you need to see this." Unzipping our tent with shaking hands, we emerged into a scene of chaos. Our campsite looked like it had been hit by a tornado. Backpacks were strewn about, their contents scattered across the ground. Our cooking gear lay in a twisted heap near the fire pit, but it was the food cache that drew our attention. The rope we'd used to hoist it high into a massive pine tree had been snapped like it was made of thread. The sturdy bear canister lay on the ground, crushed and torn open as if it were made of paper. "That's impossible," I breathed, staring at the mangled remains of our food supply. "Nothing could do that, not even a grizzly, and they haven't been seen in these mountains for a century." Mike nodded grimly, his flashlight beam sweeping the edge of our clearing. "Whatever did this, it's big and strong, really strong." As if in response to his words, a roar echoed through the night, so loud it seemed to shake the very ground beneath our feet. It was close, too close, and filled with a primal hunger that sent shivers down my spine. "We need to get out of here," Lisa said, her voice shaking. "Now." No one argued. We scrambled to grab what gear we could, shoving sleeping bags and water bottles into the few backpacks that hadn't been shredded. The entire time, I could feel eyes on us, watching from just beyond the ring of light cast by our flashlights. We were just about to make a run for it when Sarah grabbed my arm, pointing to something at the edge of the clearing. "Look," she whispered. I followed her gaze, and my breath caught in my throat. There, pressed deep into the soft earth, was a footprint, but not like any animal track I'd ever seen. It was huge, easily twice the size of my own boot, with 5 distinct toe impressions, almost human-like, but not. "We need to go," I said, tearing my eyes away from the impossible print. "Stay together, keep your lights on, and make as much noise as you can. Whatever this thing is, we don't want to surprise it." We set off down the trail, our voices raised in a cacophony of shouts and song, anything to announce our presence to the creature that stalked the night. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves had us jumping, convinced that at any moment something massive and hungry would burst from the underbrush. We'd been hiking for maybe an hour when the trail opened up into a small meadow, bathed in silvery moonlight. Under normal circumstances, it would have been beautiful, but tonight, that open space felt like a death trap. "Look," Lisa hissed, pointing to the far side of the clearing. At first, I saw nothing but shadows. Then, something moved. A massive, hair-covered figure emerged from the tree line, walking on 2 legs, but hunched forward in a way that was decidedly inhuman. In the moonlight, I could make out powerful shoulders, long arms that nearly reached the ground, and a head that seemed to sit directly on those shoulders without much of a neck. "Oh my God," Sarah breathed beside me. "It's real. It's actually real." The creature, and there was no other word for it, stood at the edge of the meadow, its head swiveling as it scanned the area. Even from this distance, I could see its nostrils flaring, scenting the air, scenting us. "Nobody move," I whispered, though I knew it was already too late. We were downwind, and that thing could probably smell our fear from a mile away. Sure enough, its head snapped in our direction. For a heart-stopping moment, we stared at each other across the moonlit clearing. Its eyes caught the light, glowing with an unnatural amber hue that spoke of intelligence and hunger. Then it charged. I'd like to say we stood our ground, that we faced the monster with courage, but the truth is we ran. Blind panic took over as we crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at our faces, roots threatening to trip us with every step. I could hear it behind us, moving through the forest with a speed and grace that something that size shouldn't possess. It was toying with us, I realized. It could have caught us at any time, but it was drawing out the chase, savoring our fear. Just when I thought my lungs would burst, the trees ahead thinned out. We burst onto a rocky slope, the ground falling away sharply to our right. In the distance, I could see lights, a highway, maybe, or a small town, civilization, tantalizingly close, yet impossibly far. "There!" Mike shouted, pointing to a narrow crevice in the rock face to our left. "We can hide in there." It was our only chance. The crevice was tight, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, but it was deep, extending back into the mountain far enough that we might be safe. We dove for the opening, wiggling through one by one. I went last, my heart pounding as I heard heavy footsteps approaching. Just as I pulled my legs inside, a massive, hair-covered arm swiped at the entrance, claws scraping against stone with a sound that set my teeth on edge. We huddled together in the darkness, hardly daring to breathe as the creature outside growled and sniffed at the opening. It knew we were in here, but it couldn't reach us. For now, at least, we were safe. Hours passed, though it felt like days. The creature paced outside, occasionally letting out a roar of frustration that echoed through our rocky shelter. We took turns keeping watch, though none of us could have slept if we tried. As the first light of dawn began to illuminate the entrance to our hiding spot, the noises outside finally ceased. We waited another hour, hardly daring to hope, before I volunteered to take a look. Cautiously, I poked my head out of the crevice. The slope was empty, no sign of the massive creature that had hunted us through the night. But there, pressed into a patch of soft earth near the entrance to our shelter, was a single, massive footprint, a chilling reminder that the night's events had been all too real. We made our way down the slope on shaky legs, exhausted and still on high alert. It wasn't until we reached the highway, flagging down a surprised trucker, that we finally allowed ourselves to relax. As we rode in the back of the truck, heading towards the nearest town and the promise of safety, I couldn't shake the image of that creature from my mind. Its face, not quite human, not quite animal, would haunt my dreams for years to come. We never told anyone the full story of what happened that night. Who would believe us? But I know the truth. Out there in the wild places, in the deep forests and rugged mountains, there are things that defy explanation, ancient creatures that have managed to survive, hidden from the modern world, and sometimes, if you venture too far off the beaten path, you might just come face to face with a legend. Story 15. I've been on dozens of search and rescue missions, but none haunt me like the day we went looking for Tim Raynor in Olympic National Park. What we found, or rather, what found us, changed everything I thought I knew about the wilderness and the creatures that call it home. It was supposed to be a routine operation. Tim, an experienced hiker in his mid-30s, had set out on a 3-day solo trek 5 days ago. When he failed to return and missed his check-in, his wife called it in. Standard procedure: assemble a team, review the missing person's intended route, and start searching. Our team of 6, myself, my partner Jake, and 4 other experienced SAR members, started at Tim's last known location, a popular trailhead on the western edge of the park. The weather was on our side, clear skies and mild temperatures, perfect for covering ground quickly. The first day yielded nothing unusual. We found signs of Tim's passage, a gum wrapper with his favorite brand, a boot print matching the treads of his hiking shoes, but nothing to indicate distress. As we set up camp that night, the mood was cautiously optimistic. People got lost in these woods all the time, and more often than not, we found them cold, hungry, and a bit embarrassed, but alive. It was on the second day that things started to get weird. We were pushing deeper into the backcountry, following what we believed to be Tim's trail. when Jake called out from up ahead, "Hey, Chris, you need to see this." I jogged up to where he stood, staring up at a massive Douglas fir. My eyes followed his gaze, and I felt my stomach drop. About 20 feet up the trunk, wedged securely in a fork between two massive branches, was a backpack. Tim's backpack, to be precise. I recognized the distinctive patch his daughter had sewn on as a good luck charm. "What the hell?" I muttered, circling the tree. There was no way Tim could have gotten the pack up there on his own. The lowest branches were a good 10 feet off the ground, and the trunk was too wide to shimmy up. Jake voiced what we were all thinking. Something put that up there. Something big. We managed to retrieve the pack using climbing gear, but its contents only deepened the mystery. Tim's supplies were mostly intact. Food, water, first aid kit, but his journal was missing, as was his satellite phone. As we continued our search, an uneasy feeling settled over the group. The forest, which had seemed so familiar and almost welcoming yesterday, now felt oppressive. The dense canopy overhead blocked out most of the sunlight, casting everything in a gloomy, greenish twilight. It was nearing dusk when we heard it for the first time, a sound that didn't belong in these woods. A sharp, percussive noise, like wood striking wood. Thock, thock, thock. We froze, looking at each other with wide eyes. The sound came again, this time from a different direction. Thock, thock. "Wood knocking," whispered Sarah, our team's wilderness expert. Native Americans used to talk about creatures in these forests that communicated that way. I opened my mouth to dismiss the idea. We were here to find a missing hiker, not chase folklore, when another series of knocks echoed through the trees. This time it was answered by a knock from the opposite direction. "We should make camp," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "And it's getting dark, and we don't want to risk missing any signs in this light." No one argued. We found a small clearing and quickly set up our tents, the knocking sounds continuing intermittently in the distance. As night fell, an oppressive silence settled over the forest. No owl hoots, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. It was as if the entire wood was holding its breath. I took first watch, sitting by our small campfire with my flashlight and radio at the ready. The others retreated to their tents, though I doubted anyone would sleep much. It was nearing midnight when I heard it, a low, guttural sound that was neither fully human nor fully animal. A chill ran down my spine as I slowly turned, sweeping my flashlight beam across the tree line. For a split second, I caught a glimpse of something. A face peering out from behind a massive cedar, but not a human face. The features were all wrong, the brow too pronounced, the eyes too large and set too far apart. In the brief moment before it ducked back behind the tree, those eyes locked with mine, glowing with an unnatural amber light. I blinked, convinced I must be seeing things. When I looked again, there was nothing there but shadows and trees. The rest of the night passed in tense silence. When dawn finally broke, we broke camp quickly, eager to be on the move. No one mentioned the knocking sounds or the strange atmosphere of the previous night, but I could see the worry etched on every face. We'd been hiking for maybe an hour when Sarah, who was on point, suddenly stopped short. "Guys," she called back, her voice tight. "You need to see this." We gathered around, and I felt my blood run cold. There, dangling from a low-hanging branch, was Tim's satellite phone. It swung gently in the breeze, the screen cracked but still faintly glowing. "Okay," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "This is unusual, but it doesn't change our mission. We keep searching. We keep calling out." Tim could still be out here, injured or disoriented. But as the day wore on, the feeling that we were no longer the hunters, but the hunted, grew stronger. More wood-knocking echoed through the forest, always just out of sight. Twice, we found sets of tracks that made no sense. Huge, humanoid footprints pressed deep into the soft earth. It was late afternoon when we made the discovery that would change everything. We'd just entered a small clearing when Jake let out a strangled gasp. "Oh my God!" There, in the center of the clearing, was an intricate structure made of broken branches and woven vines. It stood nearly 10 feet tall, rough but unmistakably deliberate in its construction, and wrapped around the top, fluttering in the faint breeze like some kind of macabre flag, was a shred of bright red fabric, the same color as the jacket Tim had been wearing when he set out on his hike. We approached cautiously, our radios crackling with static despite being well within range of our base camp. As we drew closer, I could see symbols carved into some of the branches, crude but distinct shapes that sent a shiver down my spine. "We need to call this in," I said, reaching for my radio. "Get a larger team out here, maybe bring in some experts to look at this structure." But before I could make the call, a chorus of howls erupted from the forest around us. They were like nothing I'd ever heard before, not wolf, not coyote, but something wilder, more primeval. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding us. "Run!" I shouted, all thoughts of protocol forgotten in the face of blind panic. We crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at our faces as we fled. I could hear heavy footsteps behind us, keeping pace effortlessly despite the difficult terrain. Whatever was chasing us, it knew these woods far better than we did. Just when I thought my lungs would burst, the trees ahead thinned out. We burst onto a rocky outcropping, the ground falling away sharply to our right. In the distance, I could see the glint of water, a lake or large river. "There!" Sarah shouted, pointing to a narrow crevice in the rock face to our left. "We can hide in there!" It was our only chance. The crevice was tight, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, but it was deep, extending back into the mountain far enough that we might be safe. We dove for the opening, wiggling through one by one. I went last, my heart pounding as I heard heavy footsteps approaching. Just as I pulled my legs inside, a massive, hair-covered arm swiped at the entrance, claws scraping against stone with a sound that set my teeth on edge. We huddled together in the darkness, hardly daring to breathe as whatever was outside sniffed and growled at the opening. It knew we were in here, but it couldn't reach us. For now, at least, we were safe. Hours passed, though it felt like days. The creatures outside, and I was certain now there was more than one, paced and howled, occasionally letting out roars of frustration that echoed through our rocky shelter. We took turns keeping watch, though none of us could have slept if we tried. As the first light of dawn began to illuminate the entrance to our hiding spot, the noises outside finally ceased. We waited another hour, hardly daring to hope, before I volunteered to take a look. Cautiously, I poked my head out of the crevice. The outcropping was empty, no sign of the massive creatures that had hunted us through the night. But there, pressed into a patch of soft earth near the entrance to our shelter, was a single, massive footprint, a chilling reminder that the night's events had been all too real. We made our way down the slope on shaky legs, following the sound of running water until we reached a river. From there, we were able to flag down a passing fishing boat, its occupants shocked to find a group of haggard search and rescue workers so deep in the backcountry. As we rode back to civilization, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had stumbled onto something ancient and terrifying, something that had managed to stay hidden in these vast forests, just out of sight of the modern world. We never found Tim Rayner. The official report cited animal attack despite the lack of a body. Those of us who were there that night, who saw what we saw, we know the truth. But who would believe us? Sometimes late at night, I still hear those howls in my dreams. And I wonder what else is out there, lurking in the dark corners of the wilderness, just waiting to be discovered. Story 16. I've been fishing these Canadian waters for 30 years, but nothing could have prepared me for what we encountered that day on Trout Lake. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend trip, just me and my buddy Mike. Instead, it became a fight for survival against something that shouldn't exist, outside of campfire stories and fever dreams. The morning started like any other fishing trip. We launched my old aluminum boat just as the sun was peeking over the eastern shore. The mist still clinging to the water's surface, the lake was glass smooth, perfectly reflecting the dense pine forest that surrounded it. As we motored out to our favorite spot, I breathed in the crisp air, feeling the familiar excitement of a day on the water. "Perfect day for it," "Hey, Jack!" Mike called over the putt-putt of the outboard motor. I nodded, grinning. "Couldn't ask for better. Those trout don't stand a chance." We anchored in a quiet cove, the depth finder showing about 30 feet of water beneath us. Perfect trout territory. As we baited our hooks and cast our lines, the only sounds were the gentle lapping of water against the boat and the occasional call of a loon in the distance. The first few hours were uneventful. We caught a few decent-sized trout, exchanging the usual banter and bees that comes with a day of fishing. But as the sun climbed higher, an odd tension seemed to settle over the lake. The birds fell silent, and even the insects seemed to have gone quiet. "You feel that?" Mike asked, his voice low. I nodded, scanning the shoreline. Something felt off, like the whole lake was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. That's when we saw the deer. It emerged from the tree line on the far shore, a young buck with velvet still on its antlers. Even from this distance, I could see it was nervous, its head swiveling back and forth as it approached the water's edge. "A weird time of day for a deer to be out," Mike muttered, reaching for his binoculars. I was about to agree when something happened that made my blood run cold. As the deer lowered its head to drink, the water around it exploded into motion. A massive, pale shape erupted from beneath the surface, engulfing the deer's head and forequarters in a single, terrible moment. The deer's rear legs scrabbled frantically at the rocky shore, but it was no use. In seconds, the entire animal was dragged beneath the waves, leaving nothing but ripples and a slowly spreading stain of red. Mike and I stared at each other, wide-eyed with shock. "What the hell was that?" he whispered, his face pale. Before I could answer, a low, gurgling roar echoed across the water. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before, not quite animal, not quite human. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I realized the sound had come from beneath us. "We need to get out of here," I said, already reaching for the anchor line. "Now!" Mike didn't argue. He stowed his rod with shaking hands as I hauled up the anchor. Just as I was about to start the motor, something bumped the bottom of the boat, hard. We both froze, hardly daring to breathe. Another bump, stronger this time, nearly knocked us off our feet. "Go, go, go!" Mike yelled as I yanked the starter cord. The old outboard sputtered to life just as something massive broke the surface behind us. In the split second before I opened the throttle, I caught a glimpse of a creature that defied explanation. Pale, almost translucent skin, a head far too large for its body, with eyes set wide apart, and teeth, row upon row of razor-sharp teeth in a mouth that could easily swallow a man whole. I gunned the engine, the boat leaping forward as that nightmare creature lunged for us. I felt the impact as it slammed into the stern, nearly swamping us. Mike let out a strangled yell, and I risked a glance back to see him frantically beating at a long, eel-like arm that had latched onto the side of the boat. "Get it off!" I shouted, struggling to keep us on course as the thing thrashed in the water behind us. Mike grabbed an oar and brought it down hard on the creature's arm. Once, twice, 3 times before it finally let go with a shriek that set my teeth on edge. I pushed the little boat for all it was worth, the engine whining in protest as we skimmed across the lake's surface. Behind us, I could hear splashing and that terrible, gurgling roar. It was following us. "It's gaining!" Mike yelled, his eyes wide with terror as he looked back. I could see the boat ramp ahead, tantalizingly close. But the splashing behind us was getting louder, and I knew we weren't going to make it. Not like this. "Hang on!" I shouted, spinning the wheel hard. We veered toward the rocky shoreline, the boat's hull scraping against the pebbled bottom as we ran aground. Mike and I leaped out, the cold water shocking us into action as we hauled the boat up onto the shore, just in time. A massive, pale form breached the water where we had been moments before, its momentum carrying it partially onto the rocky beach. For a heart-stopping moment, we got a clear look at the thing that had been hunting us. It was huge, easily 15 feet long, with a body somewhere between an eel and a salamander. Its head was grotesquely oversized, with bulging eyes that swiveled independently to focus on us. But it was the mouth that would haunt my nightmares for years to come, a gaping maw filled with hundreds of needle-sharp teeth, opening wide enough to swallow either of us whole. The creature thrashed on the shore, its powerful tail sending sprays of water and gravel into the air. It let out another of those terrible roars, and I swear I saw intelligence in those alien eyes. This wasn't just some animal acting on instinct. It knew us. It hated us. "Run!" I yelled, grabbing Mike's arm and pulling him toward the tree line. We crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at our faces as we fled deeper into the forest. Behind us, I could hear the creature's bulk scraping against rocks as it dragged itself up the beach in pursuit. How long we ran, I couldn't say. It felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves had us flinching, certain that at any moment those terrible jaws would close around us. Finally, gasping for breath, we burst into a small clearing. In the center stood an old fire tower, its metal frame rusted but still sturdy-looking. "Up there!" Mike panted, pointing at the tower. "It can't follow us up." We scrambled up the metal rungs, our wet clothes making the climb treacherous. Just as we reached the small platform at the top, a crash from the edge of the clearing announced the arrival of our pursuer. The creature paused at the tree line, its pale bulk heaving as it scanned the area. Those bulbous eyes swiveled upward, locking onto our position. For a long moment, it stared at us, and I felt the weight of an intelligence far older and more alien than I could comprehend. Then, with a final gurgling roar that shook leaves from the surrounding trees, it turned and began to drag itself back toward the lake. Mike and I stayed in that tower until well after nightfall, jumping at every sound from the forest below. When we finally worked up the courage to descend, we half ran, half stumbled through the woods until we reached the main road, where a startled couple in an RV gave us a ride to the nearest town. We told the local authorities what had happened, of course. They searched the area, but found nothing beyond some strange tracks on the beach and our abandoned boat. The official report blamed a bear attack, despite our protests. I've never gone back to Trout Lake. I've barely gone fishing at all since that day. The memory of those alien eyes, that gaping maw filled with teeth, is enough to keep me away from deep water for the rest of my life. But sometimes, on dark nights when the wind howls outside my window, I find myself wondering, how long has that creature been there, lurking in the depths of that quiet Canadian lake? How many other lakes might harbor similar horrors, hidden just beneath the surface? And most chilling of all, what else might be out there in the vast wilderness of this world, just waiting to be discovered? Story 17. I've been setting up trail cameras in the Ozarks for over a decade, capturing everything from playful deer to elusive mountain lions. But nothing could have prepared me for the images I found on that fateful morning in late October. What I saw on that memory card shattered my understanding of the natural world and left me questioning everything I thought I knew about the creatures that inhabit our forests. It started as a routine check of my cameras. I'd set up a new array deep in the backcountry, hoping to capture some footage of the black bears that had been spotted in the area. The hike out to the site was long and grueling, the autumn leaves crunching underfoot as I made my way through the dense undergrowth. As I approached the first camera, I felt a twinge of unease. Something felt off. The forest was too quiet. The usual chattering of squirrels and birdsong noticeably absent. I shook off the feeling, chalking it up to the natural ebb and flow of woodland activity. The first few cameras yielded the usual results: deer grazing in moonlit clearings, a fox trotting along a game trail, the occasional raccoon investigating the camera with curious paws. But as I reached for the memory card in the fourth camera, I noticed something strange. The tree it was mounted on bore deep gouges in its bark, as if something massive had clawed at it. My heart rate picked up as I popped the card into my viewer. The first few images were normal: more deer, a couple of coyotes. Then things got weird. A massive black bear lumbered into frame, its bulk filling the screen. Normal enough, except for the fact that it seemed to be looking directly at the camera with an almost human-like awareness. In the next shot, the bear was gone, replaced by something else. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the image. It was blurry, captured in mid-motion, but unmistakable. A tall, hair-covered figure, bipedal but hunched forward in a way no human would stand. Its arms were impossibly long, nearly reaching the ground. But it was the face that sent chills down my spine, not quite human, not quite ape, with eyes that seemed to glow in the infrared light of the camera's flash. My hands shook as I flipped to the next image. The creature was closer now, its features more distinct. Those eyes, they weren't just reflecting the light. They were staring directly into the camera lens with an intelligence that felt ancient and alien. The final image nearly made me drop the viewer. The creature's face filled the entire frame, a massive, clawed hand reaching out as if to grab the camera. In that moment, frozen in time, I could see every detail of its features. The heavy brow, the wide, flattened nose, the mouth slightly open, revealing teeth that were neither fully human nor fully animal. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my mind reeling as it tried to process what I was seeing. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, the legends were real, and I was holding photographic proof in my trembling hands. A twig snapped somewhere behind me, jolting me back to reality. I spun around, suddenly acutely aware of how alone I was out here in the wilderness. The forest seemed to press in around me, every shadow potentially hiding one of these creatures. I shoved the viewer into my backpack and started moving, my planned route forgotten in my haste to get back to civilization. As I half jogged, half stumbled down the overgrown trail, my mind raced. What should I do with these images? Who would believe me? And more importantly, was I being watched even now? The sound of wood knocking echoed through the trees, stopping me in my tracks. It was a sharp, deliberate sound, not the random noise of branches in the wind. Another knock answered from a different direction, then another. They were communicating, and they were surrounding me. Panic gripped me as I broke into a run, branches whipping at my face as I crashed through the underbrush. I could hear movement in the forest around me, heavy footfalls keeping pace effortlessly despite the difficult terrain. Just when I thought my lungs would burst, the trees ahead thinned out. I burst into a small clearing, momentarily blinded by the sudden sunlight. As my eyes adjusted, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the center of the clearing stood a structure, easily 10 feet tall, made of broken branches, woven together in an intricate pattern. It was unmistakably artificial, far too complex to be the work of any known animal. And wrapped around the top, fluttering in the breeze like some kind of macabre flag, was a shred of bright orange fabric, the same color as the jacket I was wearing. I approached cautiously, my every instinct screaming at me to run. As I drew closer, I could see symbols carved into some of the branches, crude but distinct shapes that sent a shiver down my spine. This wasn't just some random construction, it was a message, or a warning. A low, guttural sound from behind me made me whirl around. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood one of the creatures. It was even larger than I had imagined, easily 8 feet tall, its massive frame covered in thick, dark hair. Those eyes, those terrifyingly intelligent eyes, locked onto mine. For a moment that felt like an eternity, we stared at each other. I could feel the weight of its gaze, assessing me, deciding my fate. Then slowly, deliberately, it raised one massive hand and pointed at my backpack, at the camera viewer containing the images I'd discovered. The message was clear. It knew what I had seen, and it wanted the evidence. With shaking hands, I pulled out the viewer and held it up. The creature nodded, a gesture so human it was almost more terrifying than if it had attacked. I placed the viewer on the ground and backed away slowly. The creature approached, its movements surprisingly graceful for its size. It picked up the viewer with surprising delicacy, turning it over in its massive hands. Then, with a casual display of strength that made my jaw drop. It crushed the device into scrap. I expected it to turn on me next, but instead, it simply stood there, watching me, waiting. Understanding washed over me. It was letting me go, but the unspoken threat was clear. "Don't come back. Don't tell anyone what you've seen." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The creature returned the nod, then turned and melted back into the forest with a silence that should have been impossible for something so large. I didn't wait around. I ran harder than I've ever run in my life, not stopping until I reached my truck parked at the trailhead. As I sped down the winding mountain road, my mind raced. What should I do? I had no proof now, nothing but my own memories of those impossible images. In the end, I chose silence. Who would believe me anyway? I told my wife I had decided to give up wildlife photography, sold my cameras and tried to forget what I had seen. But on dark nights, when the wind whispers through the trees outside our home, I find myself wondering, how long have they been out there, these watchers in the woods? How many other hikers, campers and photographers have glimpsed them over the years, only to be silenced or discredited? And most chilling of all, what else might be hiding in the deep forests of this world, just beyond the reach of our scientific understanding? I may never know the answers to these questions, but one thing is certain: I'll never look at the wilderness the same way again. Because now I know that sometimes, when you're deep in the forest and you feel like you're being watched, you are. Story 18. I've patrolled these trails for 15 years, but nothing in my training prepared me for that moonlit night in Blackwater State Park. What started as a routine check of a closed trail turned into a nightmare that shattered everything I thought I knew about the natural world. It was a crisp October evening, the kind that makes you grateful for the warmth of your ranger jacket. The harvest moon hung low and heavy in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I was making my final rounds before heading back to the station, flashlight in hand, my boots crunching softly on the leaf-strewn path. The Timber Ridge Trail had been closed for weeks due to storm damage, but we'd had reports of hikers ignoring the signs and venturing out anyway. My job was simple: make sure no one was putting themselves in danger and escort any stragglers back to safety. As I approached the trailhead, the beam of my flashlight swept across the "Trail Closed" sign, its red letters stark against the weathered wood. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the usual nighttime sounds oddly muted. I chalked it up to the approaching winter, the creatures of the woods already preparing for the long, cold months ahead. I was about half a mile in when I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold and the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. A scream, high and desperate, echoing through the trees, but not just any scream. It was unmistakably a woman's voice, filled with terror and pain. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding small in the vastness of the forest. "This is Park Ranger Mike Sullivan. Do you need help?" Silence was my only answer. I stood there, straining my ears for any sign of movement, any repeat of that chilling cry. Nothing but the soft rustle of leaves in the night breeze. I keyed my radio. "Base, this is Sullivan. I've got a possible distress situation on Timber Ridge, requesting backup." Static crackled in response. I frowned, checking the device. We were well within range of the repeater towers. There shouldn't be any issues with reception out here. I tried again. "Base, do you copy? This is Sullivan on Timber Ridge. I need—" The scream came again, closer this time. It seemed to be coming from just beyond the next bend in the trail. Without thinking, I broke into a run, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I navigated the uneven ground. I burst into a small clearing, panting heavily, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow. "Hello, Mom? Where are you?" The moonlight filtered through the canopy, casting dappled patterns across the forest floor. As my eyes adjusted, I noticed something odd about the clearing. The undergrowth seemed wrong somehow, bent and twisted in unnatural ways, as if something large had recently pushed through. That's when I saw it. A flash of white in the undergrowth, stark against the dark foliage. I approached cautiously, my hand instinctively moving to the bear spray on my belt. As I drew closer, my stomach dropped. It was a hiking boot, a woman's hiking boot, to be precise, halfway hidden under a fern. And leading away from it, a trail of disturbed earth and bent vegetation, as if something heavy had been dragged into the woods. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. "Ma'am!" I called out again, my voice shaking slightly. "If you can hear me, call out. I'm here to help." A twig snapped somewhere to my left. I whirled around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. For a split second, I caught a glimpse of something, a shape, much larger than any human, melting back into the shadows, and eyes, red eyes reflecting the light, set too high off the ground to belong to any animal I knew. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away slowly, eyes scanning the tree line. Every shadow seemed to move, every rustle of leaves a potential threat. I needed to get out of here, to call for serious backup. Whatever was out here, it was way above my pay grade. I turned to head back down the trail, and that's when I heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Not bear, not mountain lion, not anything natural. I ran. All thoughts of protocol and procedure vanished as blind panic took over. Branches whipped at my face as I crashed through the underbrush, the beam of my flashlight bouncing wildly. I could hear something moving behind me, keeping pace effortlessly despite the difficult terrain. Just when I thought my lungs would burst, I burst out of the tree line onto the main park road. I bent over, hands on my knees, gasping for air. The sound of pursuit had faded, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I fumbled for my radio again, desperately hoping to get a signal now that I was out of the deep woods. "Base, come in. This is Sullivan. I need immediate backup on Timber Ridge. Possible predator attack." To my immense relief, a voice crackled through. "Sullivan, this is Base. Say again. Did you say predator attack?" I opened my mouth to respond, but movement across the road caught my eye. There, just at the edge of my flashlight's beam, stood a figure. It was huge, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, covered in dark, matted fur. But it was the face that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. Not quite human, not quite animal, with eyes that glowed red in the darkness. For a moment that felt like an eternity, we stared at each other. I could feel the weight of its gaze, assessing me, deciding my fate. Then slowly, deliberately, it raised one massive, clawed hand to its mouth in a clear gesture. Silence. The message was unmistakable. "Don't tell anyone what you've seen." Then, faster than anything that size should be able to move, it was gone. The underbrush rustled, and then nothing, just the normal sounds of the forest at night. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my mind reeling as it tried to process what I had just seen. The radio in my hand squawked, making me jump. "Sullivan? Do you copy? What's your situation?" I raised the radio to my lips, my hand shaking. What could I say? Who would believe me? "False alarm, Base," I heard myself saying, as if from a great distance. "Probably just some coyotes. I'm heading back to the station now." "Copy that, Sullivan. See you soon." I lowered the radio, my eyes drawn back to the spot where the creature had stood. There, pressed into the soft earth at the road's edge, was a single, massive footprint. Proof that I wasn't going crazy. Proof that something impossible had just happened. As I made my way back to my truck, my mind raced. What should I do? I had no real evidence, nothing but my own memories and that single footprint that would soon be washed away by rain or wind. Who would believe the ramblings of a park ranger, claiming to have seen some kind of monster in the woods? In the end, I chose silence. I filed my nightly report, making no mention of screams or mysterious creatures. I told myself it was to protect my job, my reputation, but deep down, I knew the truth. I was afraid of what might happen if I spoke up, afraid of those glowing red eyes watching me from the darkness. But on quiet nights, when the moon is full and the wind whispers through the trees, I find myself wondering, how long has it been out there, this creature that defies explanation? How many other hikers, campers and rangers have glimpsed it over the years, only to be silenced by fear or disbelief? And most chilling of all, what else might be hiding in the deep forests of this world, just beyond the reach of our flashlights and our understanding? I may never know the answers to these questions, but one thing is certain: I'll never look at the wilderness the same way again, because now I know that sometimes, when you're deep in the forest and you hear a scream in the night, it might not be what it seems, and the real monster might be the one telling you to keep quiet. Story 19. I've spent 30 years tending this lighthouse, watching over these treacherous waters. I thought I'd seen everything the sea could throw at a man. Storms that could swallow ships whole, waves tall as mountains, even the occasional whale breaching in the moonlight. But nothing could have prepared me for what emerged from the surf that stormy night. Now, as I sit here with dwindling supplies and no hope of rescue, I realize that some things are better left in the depths where they belong. My name's Tom, and this is the story of how my lonely vigil turned into a waking nightmare. It was late October, and a nasty nor'easter had been battering the coast for days. I'd battened down everything I could, making sure the lighthouse would weather the storm. It's an old girl, built back in the 1800s, but she's sturdy. Has to be, out here on this godforsaken rock 20 miles from the nearest hint of civilization. I'd just finished my nightly check of the lamp when I saw it. At first, I thought it was debris from some unfortunate ship that had fallen victim to the storm. But as I peered through the rain-lashed window, I realized this was no piece of driftwood. It was massive, easily the size of a bull elephant seal. But seals don't walk on two legs. I watched, frozen in disbelief, as the thing hauled itself up onto the rocks. In the flickering lightning, I caught glimpses of matted fur, of claws that could gut a shark, of a face that belonged in no sane person's nightmares. It raised its head and let out a roar that I felt in my bones, even through the howling wind and the thick stone walls of the lighthouse. Those eyes, God help me, those eyes! They glowed with an unholy yellow light, filled with an intelligence that had no place in a beast. I stumbled back from the window, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. This couldn't be real. I was seeing things, driven mad by isolation and the relentless storm. But even as I tried to rationalize it, I knew this was no hallucination. The thing outside was all too real. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the lamp room, clutching my old service revolver and jumping at every creak and groan of the lighthouse. But nothing came. By the time dawn broke, watery and grey through the lingering storm clouds, I'd almost convinced myself it had been a dream. Almost. As soon as it was light enough, I ventured outside to check for damage from the storm. That's when I saw the footprints. Massive, inhuman tracks in the mud, leading from the water's edge right up to the base of the lighthouse. And there, caught on a jagged rock, a tuft of coarse, dark fur. My hands shook as I picked it up. It was like nothing I'd ever seen, too coarse for a seal, too long for a bear. What in God's name had I seen last night? I retreated back into the lighthouse, barring the heavy oak door behind me. My first instinct was to radio for help, but I hesitated. Who would believe me? They'd think I'd gone mad out here, alone on my rock. No, I needed proof before I called this in, so I waited, kept watch, and prayed I was wrong about what I'd seen. The next few days passed in tense silence. I went about my duties, tending the lamp, logging weather patterns, checking the solar batteries, but my eyes were constantly drawn to the choppy waters surrounding the island, waiting, watching. It was on the third night that I heard it, a sound that didn't belong, barely audible over the ever-present crash of waves on rocks, a scraping like claws on stone. I grabbed my binoculars and rushed to the window, scanning the moonlit shore. There, movement among the rocks, something big, pulling itself from the surf with terrible purpose. My breath caught in my throat as it stood to its full height. 8 feet tall if it was an inch, with a bulk that put grizzlies to shame. But this was no bear. Its proportions were all wrong, too human-like in all the ways that mattered. It turned those glowing eyes towards the lighthouse, towards me, and grinned, revealing rows of teeth better suited to a great white than any land predator. I scrambled for the radio, to hell with proof. But as I reached for the mic, a massive shape slammed into the side of the lighthouse. The whole structure shook, and I heard the sickening crunch of electronics dying. For hours, it circled the lighthouse, testing for weaknesses. Each impact threatened to shatter windows or crack stone. I cowered in the lamp room, my revolver a cold comfort in my sweating hands. Just before dawn, the attack stopped. I crept to the window, praying it had given up. Instead, I saw it dragging something across the rocks, something long and grey and ominously still. With dawning horror, I realized it was the body of a seal, freshly killed. The creature looked up at me and very deliberately began to eat. I won't describe what I saw. I can't, but I'll never forget the sound of tearing flesh, of crunching bones, or the way those eyes never left mine, even as it fed. When it had finished its grisly meal, it let out another bone-shaking roar. A challenge, a promise. It would be back. Over the next few days, a grotesque routine developed. By day, the creature disappeared into the depths. But each night, it would return. Sometimes it brought prey, seals, fish, once even a small shark. Always, it would feed where I could see, those terrible eyes locked on me. I was a prisoner in my own lighthouse. My supplies dwindled. The radio remained stubbornly dead, no matter how I tried to fix it, and always, the knowledge that thin walls of stone and glass were all that stood between me and a nightmare made flesh. On the 5th night, it changed tactics. Instead of the brutal assaults of before, I heard scratching, gentle at first, then more insistent. It was probing, searching for a way in. I paced the lighthouse, following the sound, checking windows, doors, any possible point of entry. My mind raced. What did it want? Why was it so fixated on me? As I passed a window on the lower level, a movement caught my eye. I turned and found myself face to face with the creature. It had climbed halfway up the lighthouse, those wicked claws digging into the stone like it was soft clay. We stared at each other, separated by mere inches of glass. I saw my own terror reflected in those inhuman eyes, but I saw something else too. Curiosity, intelligence. This was no mindless beast. It was studying me, trying to understand. Slowly, deliberately, it raised one massive hand and pressed it against the glass. Was it a gesture of peace, a threat, or something else entirely? Before I could react, a sound cut through the night, distant but unmistakable. Helicopter blades. The creature's head snapped towards the sound. It let out a low growl of frustration, then turned those burning eyes back to me. For a long moment, we stared at each other. I saw the hunger there, the primal urge to hunt, but I also saw hesitation. Then, with a final huff that might have been a warning, it released its grip on the lighthouse and plunged back into the churning waves below. By the time the Coast Guard chopper landed, it was long gone. They'd been sent to check on me after days of radio silence, worried I'd been injured in the storm. I told them everything. About the creature, the nightly sieges, the grisly feedings. They exchanged worried glances, clearly thinking I'd lost my mind. The official report blamed my hallucinations on carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty generator. But I know the truth. I know what's really out there, lurking in the depths. I know that sometimes the monsters from our deepest nightmares are all too real. They offered to evacuate me, to assign a new keeper to the lighthouse, but I refused. This is my post, my responsibility, and if that thing ever comes back, well, someone needs to be here to sound the warning. So I remain, watching over these waters as I have for 30 years. But now, when I look out at the endless expanse of grey waves, I know I'm not just watching for ships in distress or approaching storms. I'm watching for something far more ancient, far more terrible. Something that crawled from the primordial depths with hunger in its eyes and the taste of man in its memory. And God help us all if it ever decides to come ashore for good. Story 20. I've driven these mountain roads 1,000 times, late nights, early mornings, in every kind of weather you can imagine. But nothing could have prepared me for what my dashcam caught that moonless night. They say the camera doesn't lie, but sometimes I wish to God it did. Because once you've seen something that shouldn't exist, something that turns everything you thought you knew about the world upside down, you can never go back to blissful ignorance. My name's Mike, and this is the story of how a routine late-night drive became the most terrifying experience of my life. It was a Friday night, or I guess you could say early Saturday morning. I'd just finished my shift at the 24-hour diner in town and was headed home. The clock on my dash read 2:17 a.m. as I turned onto the winding road that would take me up into the mountains where I lived. I'd made this drive so many times I could practically do it with my eyes closed. Not that I would, of course. These roads can be treacherous, especially at night. Deer are always a concern, and in the winter, you've got to watch for black ice. But this wasn't winter. This was late summer, a warm night with a new moon, the kind of night where the darkness seems to swallow everything beyond your headlights. I was about halfway up the mountain, mind wandering as I navigated the familiar turns, when movement caught my eye. Just for a second, illuminated in my high beams, something darting across the road ahead. My foot was on the brake before I'd even fully processed what I'd seen. Years of driving these roads had honed my reflexes. Probably just a deer, I thought, or maybe a bear. We'd had a few wandering into town lately, drawn by the easy pickings in people's garbage. But as I drew closer to where I'd seen the movement, a chill ran down my spine. Whatever I'd glimpsed, it had been big, too big for a deer, too big even for a bear, unless it was the biggest damn grizzly in the state. I slowed the car to a crawl, peering into the darkness on either side of the road. The trees pressed close here, their branches forming a tunnel that seemed to swallow up my headlights. And then I saw it again. Movement in my rearview mirror, something massive loping along the road behind my car. My heart leapt into my throat. I accelerated, eyes darting between the road ahead and the rearview mirror. Whatever it was keeping pace. How the hell was something that big moving so fast? A curve in the road ahead. I took it faster than I should have, tires squealing in protest. For a moment, I lost sight of the thing in my mirror. I began to relax, thinking maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe I was more tired than I'd realized. Maybe. It burst out of the trees directly in front of me. I slammed on the brakes, the car fishtailing as I fought for control. Time seemed to slow down as my headlights illuminated the impossible. It was huge, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, covered in thick, matted fur that seemed to absorb the light, but it wasn't the size that sent a spike of primal terror through my gut. It was the way it moved, on 2 legs, like a man that was more beast than human. As my car skidded to a halt, it turned to face me. The headlights caught its face, and I felt my heart stop. Dear God! It was like something out of a nightmare. A muzzle filled with gleaming fangs, ears pointed and alert. But the eyes were the worst part. Yellow and glowing, filled with an intelligence that had no place in an animal. For a moment that felt like an eternity, we stared at each other. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Every muscle in my body was tensed. Flight or fight responses screaming at me to do something, anything. And then it grinned, actually grinned, lips pulling back to reveal even more of those wicked teeth. It was an expression of pure predatory glee, and I knew with certainty that I was looking at my own death. It took a step towards the car. I could hear a low growl, felt it vibrating in my chest, even through the closed windows. This was it. In a moment, it would pounce, tearing through metal and glass like tissue paper to get to the soft, warm meal inside. The spell broke. I stomped on the gas, tires spinning on the asphalt as I desperately tried to get away. The creature lunged, massive clawed hands reaching for the hood of my car, but it had misjudged. Or maybe I'd gotten lucky. Either way, it missed by inches as I accelerated past. In my rearview mirror, I saw it stumble, off balance for just a moment before recovering with inhuman grace. I drove faster than I ever had in my life, taking curves at speeds that should have sent me flying off the mountain. But fear is a powerful motivator, and the image of those burning yellow eyes and gleaming teeth spurred me on. I didn't slow down until I reached my driveway, hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the key in the ignition. I sat there for a long time, engine idling, too terrified to get out of the car. Every shadow seemed to hide teeth and claws. Every rustle of leaves in the wind became the sound of a massive body moving through the underbrush. Eventually, I gathered the courage to make a mad dash for my front door. I locked and bolted it behind me, then did the same to every window in the house. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that terrible grin, those glowing eyes. It was on the third day, running on nothing but coffee and fear, that I remembered the dashcam. I'd installed it a few months back after a fender bender that wasn't my fault. Now, with trembling hands, I retrieved the memory card and plugged it into my laptop. There it was, irrefutable proof that I hadn't imagined it, hadn't hallucinated the whole thing in some sort of exhaustion-induced fugue state. The footage was grainy, the creature little more than a dark blur of movement at first, but then came that moment when it stepped in front of the car. Even in the poor quality of the dashcam, there was no mistaking what I was seeing. The massive, fur-covered body, the eerily human-like stance, and those eyes reflecting the headlights like twin flames in the darkness. I watched it over and over, part of me hoping to see something that would explain it away. A man in a costume, maybe, some kind of escaped zoo animal, anything but the reality I knew I was facing. But there was no denying it. The thing I'd encountered was no man, no known animal. It was something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist. I didn't know what to do with this knowledge. Who would believe me? I'd be laughed out of the police station if I tried to report it. The local news would write it off as a hoax or a publicity stunt, so I did nothing. I kept the footage to myself, a secret burning a hole in my hard drive. I changed my shifts at the diner, started taking the long way home that avoided that stretch of mountain road. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. That somewhere out there in the darkness, a creature with hunger in its eyes and my scent in its nostrils was waiting, watching, biding its time. Weeks passed, then months. I began to relax, to think maybe it had been a one-time thing. Maybe the creature had moved on, found easier hunting grounds, and then, last night, I saw it again. I was taking out the trash, a mundane chore I'd done 1,000 times before. The moon was full, bathing my backyard in silver light. As I lifted the lid of the garbage can, movement caught my eye. There, at the edge of the woods that backed up to my property, a massive, shadowy figure, those same glowing eyes, locked onto me with predatory intensity. It raised a hand, paw, in what almost seemed like a wave. Then it melted back into the shadows, leaving me standing there with my heart pounding and a garbage bag clutched to my chest like a shield. I don't know what it wants. I don't know why it's fixated on me. But I know it's out there, watching, waiting. And I know that someday, maybe someday soon, I'll round a corner or step outside at the wrong moment, and it'll be there. Grinning that terrible grin, ready to finish what it started on that moonless night. So I wait too. I keep my dashcam running every time I drive. I've set up security cameras around my house, because if the worst happens, if it finally decides to come for me, I want there to be proof. I want the world to know that there are things out there in the dark, things that defy explanation, things with hunger in their eyes and the taste of man in their memory. And God help us all if they ever decide to step fully out of the shadows.